Hi everyone. We're going to talk a little bit over the next couple of days about textual criticism and how that process, how we get from the Hebrew and Aramaic Old Testament and the Greek New Testament to the, let's say, English translations that we use. And textual criticism is the process by which we look at the various manuscripts that we have, the Hebrew manuscripts, the Greek manuscripts. We look at them and we determine, to the best of our abilities, what was the original reading, what was originally written in the autographs. And maybe I should take a second and define a couple of terms briefly, trying to keep this short. But the autograph is the original material that the original author put their pen to or their writing tool to. So let's say you think that Paul wrote one of the letters. When Paul's writing utensil hit the papyrus or whatever, that was the autograph, the original one that he wrote. Everything that was copied after that would be considered a manuscript. So of course we don't have any of the autographs today; they're all gone for the biblical text. And so how do we look at the many copies, the many manuscripts and manuscript fragments that we have, and determine as far as we can what the original autograph said in the various places? And I used to pastor a church, and one of the exercises that we did, I'm kind of nerdy, I wanted to show them how this worked. And so I'd use this letter exercise, and I kind of wanted to quickly walk through it with you today to sort of show you some of the basics of how, first of all, we got the many manuscripts that we have today, and then how we can sort of try to the different methodologies for trying to work backwards to see what the original reading was. Now, as a caveat here, this is not meant to be some exhaustive thing. All you textual critics out there, just this is an introductory thing. So just to kind of give everybody an idea of sort of the process by which these things can happen. So let's take a look. What I did is I wrote out by hand a letter similar to this one. And I'll walk through a couple of things here just to point it out. I wrote it by hand. It's not exactly the greatest, it's not the neatest handwriting that, or print that a person could have. And I did that sort of intentionally. So, Dear John, I wanted to write and tell you that we, and I slashed that out, I will be coming to your house next Thursday. We will be at the, and then if you look at the beginning of the next line, the again, as if I forgot that I'd already written the when I went down to write the third line. Corner of the ninth and instead of writing and with a D, I wrote with a G. Grand, I didn't capitalize the G in grand, around 7 p.m. What the hell is up with this weather? I spelled weather incorrectly. I hope it doesn't keep raining cats and frogs instead of cats and dogs all week. See you, Frank. Now I took this letter, and you can see the errors that you might consider errors. Maybe they weren't originally. For example, let's take a look down here at frogs. It's possible that John and Frank had an inside joke, right? And they maybe back in some earlier time they made some joke about cats and frogs, and they were just writing it here in this letter. So you might think that this was an error. He really meant to write cats and dogs, and maybe that's true, but it's also possible that he didn't. He actually meant to write frogs, and it was a joke between the two of them, or a play on words, or something that we didn't get reading this after the fact. So what I did is I took this and I made photocopies of it and gave them to, I think, 3 or 4 different people and said, copy this. And I didn't give any further instructions. I didn't say copy it exactly. I didn't say, make sure you correct things that are wrong. I didn't say anything. I just let the copyists sort of do what they were going to do. And it took a minute or two, or a couple minutes, and they copied it out. And then the copies of the originals that I gave them, they were to take those copies and give them to 3 or 4 other people. And then those people were to copy them. And then the process, we did it one more time. And so, I don't know, we ended up with, somewhere between 12 and 20 manuscripts, something like that. And I took them all back home and labeled each one in the upper right-hand corner, manuscript A, manuscript B, C, D, and so on. Okay? Now, I took all of the variations that I saw. For example, this is one that was really common. Here, when the writer would get to tell you that we, and then I'd crossed it out, logically, many of them didn't write the we and cross it out. They just assumed that the cross out meant I didn't want it in there, and so they took it out. So if you read the manuscript, their manuscript, it would say, and tell you that I. No evidence of the we with the line crossed out. The same thing here. We will be at the corner. If they caught that, they would delete one of the thes. If they didn't catch it, of course, it would be deleted anyway, right? Because their I would skip over it. So what I did at the end, after looking at all the manuscripts, going through and highlighting all of the variations, that's what we call them, all the variants, I put them together in a score. And if you look here, score might not be the right word here. I put them in a footnoted area down here, and put footnotes in the text wherever there was a variant. Wherever there was a variation in any of the manuscripts, I put a little superscript mark and footnoted it down here. So, for example, if you read this, Dear John, this text up here represented the original. If you look, it represents this original letter that I wrote, the autograph, right? Dear John. Well, if you look at the footnote here, manuscripts C and D, instead of writing John, they wrote Jon. So they corrected John to John. I wanted to write and if you look here at the 2, you come down, manuscripts C and D wrote write to tell you, as opposed to and tell you that. So a little syntactical change took place. So I'll point out one more, where it says here, what the hell is up with this weather, huh? If you look at footnote 13, manuscripts B and D correct that to what has been up with. Now, you can think this was done in a church setting, so them seeing what the hell is, they might feel uncomfortable writing the phrase what the hell is up. And so instead they corrected that to what has been up. So these types of corrections, and then the gathering of these types of variants, corrections was the wrong word there. These types of variants, when they occur in the texts, when you gather them from the various manuscripts and you put them down here in what we call the apparatus, you can see that each of the manuscripts that vary from the text, from the original, the original is not the right word in textual criticism sense, from the text that we're using as the base text, in this case it's the original text, you can see what all of the different variations are. Next time, tomorrow, we'll look at the different methodologies for how to interpret the apparatus, because see here, we know what the original was, right? I'm telling you that this was the original one that I wrote, but what if we didn't have the original and all we had were these variants? We would have to develop a methodology to determine which readings down here in the apparatus represent most likely the original reading. So, for example, if you didn't have the original here and all you had was down here John, and all of the other manuscripts had John John, you might say, well, let's say 8 of the manuscripts have John, and only 2 here of the manuscripts have Jon. The majority of the manuscripts have John. Therefore, the correct reading, the original reading, was John. That would be a majority, looking at the majority of the manuscripts and trying to determine what the original reading was. We'll take a look at this methodology more tomorrow, but it's not quite that simple. But this is the general, this is what we're up against, I suppose you could say, when trying to understand what the original autographs had in the biblical text. So stay tuned for tomorrow to take a look at some of the methodologies that people use to try to get back to the original autographs. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Textual Criticism Part 2, an introduction to the methodology. So much of the information that you're going to see today, and again, this is introductory material, so for all of you professional text critics out there, just forgive what I'm doing here. This is just to give a basic introduction. You can turn to Emmanuel Tov in his Textual Criticism of the Hebrew Bible, which is in its 3rd edition now in 2011. At least that's the last one that I saw. But a lot of good information, obviously, in there, and many other resources that you can utilize to look at textual criticism and how we get to the original reading. So what we're going to talk about today is what textual criticism is. As you remember, yesterday we looked at how we got to the place where we needed to do textual criticism. So having the variety of manuscripts with the variety of variants, the many different variants, and how do we figure out what the text is, the original text? What was the autograph? What was there? Because we don't have it anymore. So what is textual criticism? What are the rules, quote unquote, and the problems that are associated with them? And then we'll sort of tie it all together with a conclusion. So let's take a look. What is textual criticism? Well, there are many different definitions that you can find, but basically it's the process by which we attempt to reconstruct a text that is as close to the original as possible. So, yesterday, if you remember the daily data, and if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to go back and take a look. I think it's actually pretty neat. Go figure that I would say that. When we looked at that exercise yesterday, we had the original. I wrote the original letter, and then we had all the manuscripts, all the copies. That's not the case for the biblical text. What we have are all the copies with no autograph. So we have to reconstruct. We have to figure out what the original said. And this is, not always an easy process. But it's one that we want to try to have some guidelines, some quote-unquote rules that we utilize. And, of course, not all textual criticism is the same. If you're looking at, for example, Sumerian textual criticism, you have a very different, not very different, but a different set of objectives and tools that you're utilizing, so it's not going to look the same. But here, that's what we're focusing on. Here is the biblical text and how we get back to the autograph as much as possible. So, what methodologies can we use? Well, the main methodology is pretty simple. We want to collect all the variants, so get all the manuscripts together, like I did in that example yesterday. Get all the manuscripts together and collect all the variants, and then look at all those variants, evaluate them, and see if we can figure out what the original reading would have been. So, I want to make it clear that I'm introducing these things. This is in no way completely agreed upon. It's not like there's a rule book that people have. Many people write on textual criticism, but I feel like I'm going to, in broad strokes, talk about some of the main ideas when it comes to textual criticism. So, the majority reading equals the original. So, this is one approach that you can take. If you have 10 manuscripts and 8 of them say he walked and only 2 of them say he ran, you might say, well, 8 of them have he walked, and so that means that the original must have been he walked, not he ran. Well, that's not necessarily the case. I'm sure that obviously oftentimes that is the case. I don't even want to say often, just I'm sure that there are many times that is the case. But this method can often fail. For example, versions will often rely on one another, and so you might have different witnesses that are saying the same thing, that have the same variant, the same reading, but as it turns out, they borrowed from one another. They relied on one another, and so one of them could have had a faulty reading that was then borrowed by the rest. So you can't just broadly or universally apply this majority reading equals the original rule or methodology. So there have been, again, rules that have been developed that are text critical rules, and so I say they're in biblical textual criticism. Other guidelines are necessary. So these are some of the quote-unquote rules that have been developed. Rule number 1, the more difficult reading is preferred. So if a scribe encountered a difficult reading, for example, a word that was odd to him or seemed out of place, for example, in our text yesterday, the phrase "cats and frogs," it's raining cats and frogs. A scribe might come to that, if that was the original reading, and say, "Whoa, cats and frogs, that's not what it's, cats and dogs." And so he might correct that to cats and dogs. Well, if you had 3 manuscripts that had cats and dogs and 1 manuscript that had cats and frogs, you might say, well, now it makes more sense that it should be cats and dogs. But that might simply be the result of a scribe coming to the phrase cats and frogs, which was the original, and saying, "This, I don't understand this, it doesn't make sense. I'm going to correct it to something easier, something that makes more sense." So, scribal errors, so that's one problem that you might have, right? Or that's the idea behind this. The more difficult reading might be the correct reading, and oftentimes is. However, you can't universally apply that, because scribal errors themselves could also create a more difficult reading. So, if you for example, in that same, I guess I can just keep going back to my example. In one of the lines, I say, I spell the word "and," A-N-G. Well, that's a more difficult reading than A-N-D, and. And of course, that's not a good example, because in that example, that is the original reading. But if a scribe were to accidentally write A-N-G instead of A-N-D, anticipating the G of the next word, for example, that would be a scribal error that would create a more difficult reading. We can't necessarily go with the more difficult reading. So it's a good rule, quote unquote, to go with the more difficult reading, but you can't universally apply that. Rule number 2, the shorter reading is preferable. So scribes tended to expand text, for example, making things more explicit, adding glosses. So, if they thought it was unclear what the subject of a sentence was, they might mark it in such a way, expand it in such a way to make sure that you understood that it was the subject or that it was the object. Or if there was a gloss that you could add to make sure that the person understood what word you were talking about specifically, they might do that. So then that longer reading, that expanded reading, that gloss, that was put on there, would represent a later correction, or a later addition to the text. And so the shorter reading would be preferable. But you can't universally apply this, because it can be difficult to know if there were accidental deletions, right? So you can't just go to a text and say, well, this one is shorter, this one's longer, therefore the shorter one works, because it's not always the case. Rule number 3, and there are others, but I'll stick with these 3 because they're pretty popular, and I think kind of lay out the points well. Interpretive changes that were applied to the text. So there are some difficult passages, and those were changed to align with more more common or applicable theological interpretive views of the scribe. And so if there was something there that it had a theological difficulty for the scribe, or an interpretive problem. When he was thinking about another text, he might make a small change so that text would align with his theological interpretive view. Well, the problem is you can't always know which ones are interpretive changes, right? So you can't just say, oh, well, looks like an interpretive change, so we have to go with the other one. It can be very difficult to know if such a change is interpretive, or if it is a change, right? If a text represents an interpretive change, it may actually be what was originally written. So it's subjective on the part of the text critic. So we can't just universally apply this one as well. So what can we conclude here, right? And I think it's clear, and I'm trying to keep this short, but I think it's clear just from the way I'm describing these things. These rules can be good, right? And they are good. And they're things that you want to keep in mind. So I say they should be considered guidelines or tools in your toolkit rather than, hard and fast rules, which is, of course, why I put them in quotation marks. But these are tools or guidelines that the textual critic can use to identify original readings or original reading in a text. But you can't universally apply these things in a way that fits all situations. So you don't, for example, as a text critic, want to come now, armed with some of these rules. You don't want to go to, for example, Romans 5:1 and say, well, let us have peace, and we have peace. Well, we know which one because of rule number 2. We know which one it is. That would be that would just be a too simplistic and not a sophisticated enough approach to the passage. You have to the variant. You have to make sure as a text critic that you're using these tools, these guidelines, but you're using them in a way that takes into account all of the other things that are going on in the text. So tomorrow, so yesterday I showed you an example of how we get to where we are with the biblical text. Today I showed you some of the rules or guidelines that you can use in textual criticism and that are used in textual criticism. Tomorrow, I'm going to actually show you, not going into tremendous amounts of detail, but how this sort of plays out and what you're looking at when you look into the Hebrew Bible. So textual criticism in the Hebrew Bible, an inside look. I'm actually going to show you pictures of Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, BHS. Of course, I'll talk about other resources that are used or other editions that are used, but BHS was the one I cut my teeth on. BHQ exists now. I know that, everybody, but I think it's still easier to use BHS. But that was way too much detail. Sorry, everybody, just ignore the last 15 seconds. I'll show you tomorrow what it looks like actually on the page and how we can practically go through and utilize a critical text edition so that you too can start to see what people mean when they say, oh, well, that word actually is different in the Septuagint, or that word is different in the Masoretic text, or that word blah, blah, blah. You can see how it is that they're identifying those things. Okay, I'll see you guys tomorrow. Hi, everyone. Welcome to part 3 of Textual Criticism and Introduction. Today we're going to be taking a look at the actual pages in the Hebrew Bible and how they're laid out and how you can use them as a text critic to try to understand the different readings, the different variants that are found in the Hebrew Bible. We're going to look very briefly at the layout of each page, how to use the notes on the page, again, very briefly, and more importantly, how to use the apparatus at the bottom. So let's take a quick look at the layout of the page. So here we have Exodus chapter 3 in what's called Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, which is BHS for short. And if you take Hebrew, this is probably the Hebrew Bible that you will use, the critical edition that you will use. There's a new version coming out, Biblia Hebraica Quinta, which is still in fascicle form, but at least last I heard. But this is what is generally used. So on the page, you have 4 primary parts. The main text, this is the actual Hebrew Bible. The Masora Parva, the small Masora, these are notes from the scribes out in the margins. The Masora Magna, which are references to a long list long list of notes published in a separate volume. Don't have to worry about that too terribly much. And then under the yellow there, you see this bottom apparatus, the critical apparatus. That's probably the most important part for the text critic. So let's take a closer look. Now that you understand sort of the different parts, the main things that you need to worry about are the body of the text, and then what's underneath of this yellow box. A quick note, though, on this Masora Parva on the side. Over here are written notes about things that the scribes thought were interesting, or things that were more complex or noteworthy. One of the things, though, that is shown consistently out here are things called Qere and Ketiv. And Qere and Ketiv is Aramaic. It means what is read and what is written. And I'll do a daily data probably next week, and I'll talk about a very important Qere and Ketiv, which is the Tetragrammaton, the word Adonai, Yahweh, that shows up in the text. And a very common misunderstanding of what is written and what is read has led to something that I think all of you will find interesting, because you'll know exactly what it is, and I think you'll be surprised to know that it's an error. It's a faulty understanding of what the biblical text was saying, and that's the word Jehovah. So we'll talk about that in a daily data next week. But let's move on to the more important part, I suppose, for our discussion today, and that is this critical apparatus under the at the bottom of the page. So again, we're in Exodus chapter 3, and I want to draw your attention down to verse 14. Now, if you understand Hebrew, this will be a little easier, obviously, for you. If not, don't worry about it. I'm just going to read what the text says. And God said to Moses, here, let me bring my mouse up. And God said to Moses, however we want to translate this, I will be what I will be. This is that really important verse. And he said, thus you will say to the sons or the children of Israel, I will be whatever sent me to you. This phrase right here, if you look, there's a tiny little B. And that B is it's a footnote marker. And it tells you to come down here and look at this B. Now let me draw your attention to this here. We're in verse 14. And as you come along, you see A, these two go together. And of course they go with the verse 14, AA. That's a variant right here. We're just going to deal with this one today. You continue on in verse 14, you come to a B. And it's just one. That means it deals with this right here. You come down to the B. It says a multitude of manuscripts and the Samaritan Pentateuch have this phrase. So how do I explain this? This consonant here means two or four, but here in this phrase it means two. So to the children of, or to the sons of, whatever. Instead of writing the lamed to, they use a different word, L, which also means two. So these are, synonymous. These mean the exact same thing, but they're just written. They're using different forms. to mean the same thing. But this is a variant. But that's what you do. You see, you look down here, you find your footnote, you come down here and you look at which manuscripts, which versions have this variant reading, and then they show you what the variant reading is. That's really how this text is meant to be used. So again, if you look at the one we looked at before, the A and the A, what goes in between, you come down to verse 14, A to A, and it tells you that this text, this Greek text, which we can get into later if you like, is what stands in this place. So that's how this is used. Seems straightforward, and I guess in some ways it is. The problem is, as we talked about last week, how to understand. This is how you collect the variants, right? This is how you collect them. The analysis of the variants is the more complicated part. The nice thing about this text is that the variants have been collected for you, right? The person, the people that put together BHS brought all the variants together for you so that you can then analyze them at a glance. But this is how you use the text and the apparatus to try to get at the meaning behind the different variants. So, we've talked about the Hebrew Bible. In the next Daily Data, tomorrow, we're going to be looking at the Greek New Testament, the Nestle-Aland 27. It's the one I cut my teeth with. And I'll show you again, similarly, how you have the body Greek text, and then underneath of it, the apparatus, which shows you the variants. So stay tuned for that, and should round out the week with a decent introduction to textual criticism. So stay tuned. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Part 4, the final part in our 4-part series on textual criticism and introduction. This week, we're looking at, this episode, we're looking at the Greek New Testament. We looked at the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, yesterday, and we'll finish up here looking at the Greek. Again, trying to keep this short, just an introduction, and we can go into more depth later if you guys would like. So, send me an email if you want to go into more detail about this topic. So, just as yesterday, we're going to look at the layout of each page, try to understand the basics of the notes, and then how to use the apparatus. So, this is a page from the Greek New Testament, Nestle-Aland 27. Now, Nestle-Aland 28 is out, for those of you that are critiquing me. No play on words intended. But this is just Nestle-Aland 27 is the text edition that I cut my teeth on, so that's the one I'm going to be using. And just as with Biblical Hebraica Stuttgartensia, BHS, from last week, the Hebrew text, you have the main body, which is the text itself, is the Greek New Testament text. Here we're in the book of Romans. In the margin, we have notes. These are references to parallel passages or to passages that have similar topics or ideas, but just sort of as a cross-reference. And then down in the bottom, yet again, we have our apparatus. So just as with the biblical Hebrew text or the Hebrew Bible, we want to compare the text that's in the main body to the variants that are found down in the apparatus. So let's do that now. Here we're in the book of Romans, chapter 5. And if we look at verse 1, over here, we see this little half bracket. And that tells us that this word has been replaced, part of it or all of it has been replaced with another word. And if we look down in the apparatus, notice chapter 5, verse 1, we see that little half bracket, which tells us that we're looking at this form. Now, again, if you don't read Greek, that's okay. if you notice, starting with, let me pull my mouse up here, this letter that looks like an X is what we're starting with here. Notice the dash. That means that this is not the entirety of the word. They're just saying from here forward. That's different than from here forward. Now, what is the difference? Well, up here, we have an omicron, which looks like a little O. And down here, we have an omega. That's the only difference in these words. Now, the difference, of course, is significant. And that's why I brought, of course, this verse up, this variant up. A common means we have in the indicative. A 𝀭men, which is what's down in the apparatus, means let us have in the subjunctive. So, of course, the verse is talking about we have peace with God, or let us have peace with God, which is pretty significant as far as the difference. So we'd want to analyze this one, right? Of course, we want to analyze all of them, you say. But if you look at the witnesses, and that's what we call these, notice all of the witnesses here, and we don't have to go into what all of these are. It's not important at the moment. All of these are for this reading. They all have this reading. They all support that reading. However, after this colon looking thing, it says TXT, which means the text, what's up here. The text is supported by all these manuscripts. So you notice there are a lot on both sides, right? Now, we can go into more detail later on if you would like about analyzing each of these witnesses and which ones provide stronger reading. But the point is that this is how we look at these individual variants to determine. This is the information that we begin with to try to determine which reading we should take. So just like with the Hebrew Bible, BHS, the apparatus here is the place that all these variants have been collected for you. And so what your job is as the text critic, or probably in the beginning more likely as you read through someone's commentary or you read through someone's analysis of a particular variant, you can follow along and you can say, oh, okay, he's saying that Romans 5:1, where the text says we have peace with God, he's arguing that it doesn't say that. It says, let us have peace with God. Well, now I understand why, because I can look at the variants here in the text and see all the sources that support that other reading. Okay. That does it for Introduction to Textual Criticism. Next week, amongst other things, I just sort of want to put a teaser out there. I mentioned this yesterday. We're going to talk about in the Hebrew Bible the origin of the name Jehovah, and I think it'll be a neat daily data and something that you definitely want to tune in for next week. Thanks. Hi everyone, welcome to Textual Criticism of the Old Testament. This is a continuation of the series that we did last week. We'll do it today and tomorrow, then get into some more interesting sort of linguistic stuff. But today we're going to talk about these funny little things called Qere and Ketiv writings. And if you've studied Hebrew and you've worked with your BHS, your Hebrew Bible, you've probably run across Qere and Ketiv. Well, I think it'd be a good idea for everybody to understand sort of what these writings are, what the scribes were trying to do, the Masoretic scribes were trying to do in putting them there, and how it can help us understand some of the subtleties maybe of Old Testament textual criticism. So we're going to take a look at what Qere and Ketivs are, figure out how to recognize and understand them, and then we're going to briefly look at something that they call the perpetual Qere and Ketiv and what that means and what significance that can play when we try to understand the Hebrew text. So let's just take a look at it and see if we can break it down in understandable terms. So sometimes a scribe who is copying the text would question the words or the forms that he was copying. So let's say he's copying through the book of Genesis, and he sees a word in the text and he thinks, I think that this is wrong. I think this is an error. Excuse me. The problem is that they considered that text sacred, so they didn't want to just go changing it. They didn't want to write what they thought was the correct form. So instead of changing the consonants, which is, what was the big thing in the text, the primary thing in the text, what was transmitted down, initially anyway, they wrote the vowels, which in Hebrew are written above, usually above and below, sometimes right in the middle of the consonants, but usually below or above the consonants. They wrote the vowels for the word that they thought was the correct word around the consonants that were in the text. And what this produced was sort of a goofy looking word that didn't make any sense. So then they would put the correct consonants out in the margin. Okay, maybe that didn't make any sense, so let me see if I can put it into easier to understand terms. If you've watched our videos on textual criticism, you might recognize this. This was that letter exercise that I did. And if we come down here to the signature where it says "CU Frank," let's say the scribe saw that word Frank and they thought, I don't think it's Frank. I think he meant to say Robert. It was supposed to be Robert, because we know from the context that it's actually Robert that's writing these letters, for example, and maybe Frank wrote another letter, but that's why the scribe made this mistake. So he didn't want to change Frank. Of course, all they had were the consonants. He didn't want to change the word Frank, so what he did is he took the vowels from the word Robert, so the O and the E from Robert, and put them on the consonants of the word Frank, and came up with this word Phronic, for example. And of course, we look at that and we say, what in the world is Phronic? Then we would look out in the margin and we would see Robert with the word read underneath of it. And we would say, oh, okay. So the person copying this didn't want to change the word Frank, even though he didn't think Frank was the right word. So he used the consonants for Frank, F-R-N-K, and the vowels for Robert, and put them together to make this weird looking word, so that we as the reader would be reading through and we'd say, "CU Phronic." What in the world is oh, maybe this is oh yeah, out here in the margin, Robert. That's what he's trying, and he's got this little note that says, "Read Robert." Well, Qere, Ketiv, those are Aramaic words. And Qere means what is read, that which is read. And Ketiv means that which is written. And so, in our example, the Ketiv, that which is written, would be this form. And the Qere, what is read, would be this form. So, essentially, the scribe is trying to say, I want to keep the consonants for this word that's in the text, but I want to add the vowels from this word, and that'll give you this goofy looking form that should tell you, hey, go out to the margin and see if there's a Qere out there, a word to be read. And yep, sure enough, there it is. So how does this play out in the Hebrew Bible? So the word in the text will appear very strange, like our word Phronic, having vowels that do not seem to go with the consonants. That tells you to go out to the margin, where the correct consonants, at least what the scribe considers to be the correct consonants, will often appear. And I say often because of what we're going to talk about a little bit later, along with the Hebrew letter Kof underneath of it. And that is the first letter. The Kof is the first letter of the word Qere. So the scribe is trying to tell you, Qere, read what is written, these letters. So let me just show it to you here in the text. So here's screenshot of the book of Joshua. And down here, in the highlighted section, we see this word gavol, hagavol, and it's a weird word, right? Like, what does that mean? Because we're used to seeing the word gavul or gavul here, but gavol is just a weird word, right? That doesn't seem to make any sense in this context. And if we look out in the margin, lo and behold, we have a little mark, and I'll bring it up here a little bit. Notice the word, or the kof. This is the Hebrew letter kof from Qere, first letter in the word Qere, and the scribe is telling you this is what should be read, right? And what they're telling you is use these consonants and these vowels. This little T looking thing down here is a vowel. This little dot up here is a vowel. And this is the ah sound and the o sound. And what they're trying to tell you is put this vowel down here under the G, the gimel, this is a gimel, a G sound, and put this dot, this cholim, the o sound, above this vowel here. And what you will see then is this word becomes hagadol, which means big. You say, oh, or big, or great. Okay, well, this says, and the great sea. Well, that makes sense, right? That makes sense in the context. So what they're trying to tell you is use these consonants with these vowels. That is the Qere and the Ketiv. So they don't end up changing the consonants at all. All they do is put weird vowels on the consonants, which form a word that doesn't make any sense in the context. And that should trigger you as the reader to go out to the margin and look for this kof right here. And then say, oh, here are the consonants that he's trying to tell me to read. So that is the scribe's way of correcting the text without physically or actually correcting it in the body of the text itself. So we know what a Qere Ketiv is. We know how to identify it. Now, there is something called a perpetual Qere Ketiv. And if you think to yourself, well, geez, what if there's a word that, because it's not always a word that the scribe thought was in error. Maybe it's a word that they think shouldn't be pronounced out loud. For example, the word Yahweh, or Yahweh, or Adonai, or however you want to say it. Let's say Yahweh. They didn't want to say out loud the word Yahweh. And so what they did is they chose to say Adonai, Lord, my Lord, instead. And so what they did, because Yahweh occurs so often in the text, they didn't want to put out in the margin forever. I mean, it would really, clog up or fill up the margins with this word that's used so often in the Hebrew Bible. So what they did is they just assumed that as a reader you would know that when you saw these words that appear over and over and over and over again that are a Qere Ketiv to the scribes, that you would just know, oh, this is that really common word. The vowels don't go with these consonants in the text. So words that occur very frequently will often only have the vowels changed in the text, but have no Qere in the margin. Let's take a look. So last week we looked at Exodus chapter 3, and up at the very top you see the tetragrammaton. This is the word Yahweh, or Yahweh, however you want to pronounce it. But notice there's nothing out here in the margin. And if you look at if you know Hebrew and you look at the vowels, the vowel pointing here, they don't actually go with these consonants, right? This is an sound, this is an sound, and they don't go with these consonants. However, they do go with the word Adonai, They go with the word that, the Qere that would be out here if it weren't so common that they didn't think they needed to put it out here. But these go with the consonants for Adonai, my Lord, in plural. And so this is called a perpetual Qere and Ketiv because they're just changing the vowels. They're just putting these weird vowels in here because they assume that you know when you read through here that you wouldn't read Vayar Yehovah. You would read Vayar Adonai. So that's a perpetual Qere and Ketiv, and these occur in the Hebrew text with some frequency. So that's a good segue for what we're going to talk about tomorrow, because the name Jehovah is a direct result of misunderstanding this Qere and Ketiv phenomenon. And so tomorrow what we'll do is I'll show you where Jehovah comes from and why it's actually not meant as an actual word, at least by the Masoretes. So tune in tomorrow to see the error that is Jehovah. That sounds really bad, but the error that is the word Jehovah. Okay, see you guys tomorrow. Hi everyone, welcome to today's Daily Data, and today we're going to be talking about the word Jehovah. If you remember yesterday, we talked about the Qere and Ketiv and how they would write something in the main text and then write a note out in the margin that told you that the word in the main text wasn't supposed to be read the way that it was written in the text. So, for example, we saw in the text, what word was it? We saw this word in the main text, or in the main body, and these, these consonants and vowels didn't go together. But out in the margin, we saw this, which means gadol and means big, and that works in this context. Well, then we saw, so this was the Masoretes way, just trying to review here, this was the Masoretes way of saying not to read what's in the main text, not to pronounce that out loud, but to pronounce what's out in the margin. So then we saw that some words, like this one, Yod He Vav He, happen so frequently and are not supposed to be pronounced as they are written in the main text. But they happen so frequently that instead of going out here and writing this word, Adonai, they just said, you know what? They know what it's supposed to be. We're not going to put it out there. So instead, they just wrote, these vowels. And these vowels, of course, do not go with those consonants. Now, let's talk about this. The consonants for the name of the Lord in the Old Testament are these: Yod, He, Vav, He. Instead of pronouncing Yahweh or Yahweh, they would instead Adonai. So Hebrew is read this way. You have your consonants, right? And you have your vowels. Vowel, vowel, vowel. Okay. You read it this way. That's how Hebrew is read. So you read that, then you come back up here, and usually the vowels are down here, right? Sometimes the vowels are up here, so that's where I'm getting this pattern, because you usually go back down. In this case, you go back up, and then like that. You read this consonant, then this vowel, then this consonant, then this vowel, then this consonant, then this vowel, which goes with this consonant. And the pronunciation is a, do, nai, Adonai. What we're supposed to do, right, is we're supposed to take the vowels from this word and put them onto this word. So, right, putting this one here, this one up here. That was silly. And then this one here. Okay. When we do that, this sound here, it sort of depends a little on the consonant that it goes with. Here, it's like a sound. So, So when you pronounce, so this is o, ah. O, ah. When you put them with these consonants, what you end up with, so let me just write out, this is the better way to do it. These are the consonants. This is a Y sound, this is an H sound, this is a V sound, or a W, whatever. What you end up with is Ye, Ho, Va. So, of course, in German, you can get the J from the Y, Jehovah. So, what we're seeing here with the word Jehovah is the faulty combining of the vowels of the Qere, what's supposed to be read, with the consonants of the Ketiv. And when you put those together, you get Jehovah, Yehovah. So really, Jehovah is not a word, right? The Masoretes weren't anticipating anybody pronouncing this Jehovah. What they were anticipating is that you would see the tetragrammaton here, and you would say, nope, I'm not supposed to pronounce Jehovah, I'm supposed to pronounce Adonai. But instead, if you combine these consonants with these vowels, you get this weird amalgamation, Jehovah, Yehovah. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of an understanding of the misreading that is the name Jehovah, right? It's not really a word. I mean, it is a word now because people use it, but it was a mixing, an incorrect mixing of the Qere Ketiv phenomenon by reading the vowels from the Qere onto the consonants of the Ketiv. It's a person coming along to the form and instead of saying, oh, I need to go out to the margin and see the Qere, trying to pronounce this instead, and mixing Adonai and Yahweh and getting Jehovah. Okay, we'll do our next daily data on Thursday. See you then. Happy 4th. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Textual Criticism of the Old and New Testaments. This is sort of a continuation of a series that we've been doing for the past week and a half on our daily data. And we're going on with it because there's been such a good response. And, of course, if you don't like it, start letting me know. But I feel like this stuff is pretty interesting, and there's a lot more that we could cover. So let's get into it. For the next couple of days, we're going to be looking at errors of the copyist. So what kinds of errors did the copyist make, the scribes make? There were unintentional errors and intentional changes. So for the next 2 days, we're going to look at unintentional errors. Today, we'll look at part 1, the first series of unintentional errors. By the way, there's a book Paul Wegner wrote, Student's Guide to Textual Criticism of the Bible, Its History, Methods, and Results, published in 2006 by IVP. InterVarsity Press. So excellent book. Most of the information is going to be coming out of it just because it's put together in such a useful way. But I recommend you get it if you're interested in this topic and follow along with us as we go. So we're going to look at mistaken letters, homophony, haplography, and dittography. So mistaken letters. There are a lot of letters in both the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament Greek that look similar to each other. And one example here from the Hebrew Bible is the confusion of resh and dalet. So resh is an R sound, dalet is a D sound. The resh is there on the left, the dalet on the right. If you look at the first word, it's pronounced dodanim in Genesis 10:4, dodanim. But in 1 Chronicles 1:7, we see that same word rodanim with an R, and the thought is that dodanim was a confusion, confused the word rodanim, because the resh and the dalet look so similar, and you can see them there if I can get my mouse. This is the dalet, of course, and this is the resh, and you can see the rest of the word is exactly the same, and you can see how you could confuse these two letters. In the New Testament, capitalized text, the omicron and the theta look very similar. Of course, the only difference is this horizontal line in the middle. So, has, the one who is very similar to theos. This is a shortened form of it, God. And so you can see how these two could be confused because they look so similar. So similar letters, mistaken letters. Homophony. So similar sound. So in English we say dear and dear. They sound the same, but they're spelled differently. Pain and pain. The same sort of mistakes can be made. Many of these texts were copied from dictation. So if you can, if you're listening to someone speak and you write something down, you can make mistakes. So in Isaiah 9:2, we have the word lo, lamed vav, which means to him. Or in other manuscripts, we have lo, the word for no or not. And of course, you can see the sounds are exactly the same, lo and lo. So you can see how those two would be mixed up. We've talked about this in a previous video, Romans 5:1, the difference between ekamen, we have, and ekomen, let us have. Haplography, so the deletion of a letter, word, phrase, etc., because of a co-occurrence of a similar form. So if you're reading through something, remember when you transcribe, when you copy these things, it's not like a keyboard that you have where you can sit there and know where the keys are and type without actually looking at the screen. They had to look up and then look back down to write, then look up, find their place, look back down to write. And when you do that, there are a lot of omissions that you can make or additions that you can put in, depending on the context, based on words that have similar endings or phrases that look the same. But haplography is when you skip over something because you have a similar word. So, for example, if you were copying the sentence, I like ice cream, I like dogs, I like coffee, I like music, I like, you might write, I like ice cream, then look down, right? So you'd say, I like ice cream. You'd look down, you'd write, I like ice cream. You'd look back up, and you see I like so many times there that you skip to the wrong one. So if you notice in the second sentence, I like ice cream, I like coffee, it skips over I like dogs because of the similar I like beginnings. This is a type of haplography. So in this text, the phrase b'nei, so b'nei Binyanim, so the sons of Benjamin. If you notice the letters, even if you don't know Hebrew here, you can look at this. Beit, Nun, Yod, these three letters are the same here. Beit, Beit, Nun, Nun, Yod, Yod. So if you look down, you copy this, then you look back up, you see this, you write it, and you look back up, your eye might automatically skip here, and you just write the mem and the nun, and you delete out, it ultimately deletes out this phrase or this word. So the sons of Benjamin. So you could delete the sons of, and as you notice, right up here, that's exactly what we think happened. And if you watched our Qere and Ketiv video, you know what's going on here. This is actually a really interesting form, because remember we said that they put the vowel pointing for the word that they want pronounced. Well, normally they think the word is, they think the word that's there is incorrect, so they put different vowel points on it. But here, they think that the word was deleted. They think that this word was deleted. And so instead of putting them around different consonants, they left a blank space and put the vowels in there. But again, they're not changing the consonantal text, and that's what's important. But that's a haplography there, so you can see how that happened. Dittography, and I think this is the last one we're going to cover today. The word, phrase, etc. is written twice, and sometimes for similar reasons. So, for example, in Mark 3:16, kai poiesen tous dodeka, and he appointed the 12. That phrase is repeated from verse 14. So it looks like the scribe looked down, wrote stuff out. Then when he looked back up at the original text, he wrote this phrase again because his eyes skipped to the wrong verse. And so he wrote that phrase again. And then when he looked back up again, he went to the right spot and kept going. And so this is a type of dittography. So you can see the word ditto in that. Ditto writing, a second writing, a copied writing. So these are some basic errors that show up all the time. And they're understandable. They're unintentional. Scribes didn't mean to do them. But this is the product of copying things by hand. So tomorrow we're going to look at part 2 of the unintentional errors. There are, I think, 5 more that we're going to go through. And then we'll move on to the intentional changes that the scribes made to the text. So join us tomorrow for part 2 of the unintentional errors. Thanks. Welcome back, everyone, to part 2 of our errors of the copyist, unintentional errors. Textual criticism in the Old and New Testament. Again, we're looking at Paul Wegner's book on textual criticism. I encourage you to get it if this topic interests you. It's a really easy read. So yesterday we looked at the first set of unintentional errors that the scribes made when they were copying by hand. And today we're going to look at the second set of unintentional errors, finish it up before we move into the intentional changes that the scribes made. So we're going to look at metathesis, the difference between fusion and fission, and then finally some wonderful Greek words, homoioteluton and homoioarchton. So metathesis, when 2 letters or words are reversed. So I do this all the time. I don't know if you do this when you type, but I will look back through and see that stupid little red squiggly line because I have hit the H and the E in the incorrect order in the. So te, everywhere. It's everywhere. Instead of writing thus. So the H and the E are metathesized. They would say that they've swapped places. Well, this sort of stuff also happens when you copy by hand. So in Deuteronomy 31:1, the Masoretic text reads, Vayelech Moshe. And you can see here, again, you don't have to read Hebrew to catch this, but the Yud, Lamed, Kaf. This letter, this letter, this letter. They're in that order. Yud, Lamed, Kaf. However, at Qumran, we see Vav, Vav, Yud, Yud. This letter and this letter are the same. This is how it shows up when it's at the end of a word. These 2 letters are the same, and then there's your Lamed. Notice that the positions have been reversed. This is metathesis. They've been swapped. John 1:42 we think is another example of metathesis in the New Testament. So Ioannou and Yonah, but you notice here that Ioannou, the alpha and the nu are metathesized. It appears that what has happened is that after these metathesized, there was a deletion of the O and the U, the omicron and the upsilon on the end of the word, but you see that those letters have metathesized, they've reversed. Fusion. Two words are fused together. So if we had the sentence, the man held his hand out, like extended his hand, but we saw an error, or we saw a text that had the man held his hand out, like somebody gave him a photocopy of something as an example during a lecture, and he held it in his hand, the man held his hand out. That would be the fusion of two words together, erroneously. In Leviticus 16:8, we think we have an example of just this thing. So the phrase for Azazel, la Azazel, if you notice, you separate these two here, it becomes two different words. This doesn't really work in the context. However, in the context, this does work for the go to the departure. And so you separate the words here, and the phrase now makes sense. It looks like what has happened is that these two words got fused together erroneously. In Mark 10:40, instead of having al hois, but for whom, from Allah and hois, you have alois, which is for others. And so this is these two different words, these two separate words being fused together into an erroneous form. Now the opposite of this would be fission. So if a single word is erroneously divided into two. So we think we see this in Hosea 6:5. So the Masoretic text has this. This letter and this letter are the same letter. This one just shows up when it's at the end of the word. Notice in this form, it's on this word, and in this form, it's over here on this word. So this is moving a form over here, and the translation is very different, right? And your judgments, light goes forth. But here, and my judgment goes forth like light. Now, the interesting thing here is that we don't have actual Hebrew that says this. What we have is the Greek Septuagint reads this in the Greek. So what we think is the Vorlage, the text that the Septuagint, or that portion of the Septuagint was translated from, probably had this. It probably shifted over. Or at least that difference. And in Romans 7:14, instead of oidamen, we know, you can have, they do have oida men. On one hand, I know. Sorry, it's supposed to be on the one hand. See? Look at that. I did a topography myself. It's supposed to be on the one hand. See? But I did that intentionally because this is a textual criticism video. Just kidding. So, you can see there that the words have been separated, or the word has been separated. Oida men going to oida space men. All right, the last two we're going to look at, homoiotoluton and arcton. These are the deletion of words, phrases, etc. because of similar beginnings or similar endings. So the I skips from one word with a similar ending to another word with a similar ending. So if we had the phrase, we run and have fun outside, the UN and the UN might draw your eye. If you were writing this and you wrote, we run, you read that, you looked down, you wrote, we run, and then you looked back up and you saw the UN here, you might write outside and delete all of this because your eye skipped from here to here. And so you would have, we run outside. So if you're a text critic and you see a bunch of manuscripts have this, and then you see one that has this, you might say to yourself, oh, okay, this is a homoiotoluton. We run outside, his eye skipped down here and he deleted these words. The other kind is where you have similar beginnings, the homoiarcton. So the example that I showed earlier, I like ice cream, I like dogs, I like coffee, I like music. These all have similar beginnings. So if your eye skips to the similar beginning, you might delete all the stuff that's in the middle. So a good example of this is this passage here in 1 Samuel So if you look, again, if you don't know Greek, that's okay. You can just kind of look at the forms and notice their similarities. The Lord God of Israel. There it is again, the Lord God of Israel. And then, this is the important part. So you notice that already this phrase is repeated in this verse. But here, Israel, Israel, Israel. Well, it might be that if your eye skipped from this Israel down to this Israel, what you might do is delete all that text. So you might look at this and say, get to this form Israel, look down, write it, then look back up, and your eye comes here, and you keep writing, which would delete all of this text. And if you notice, this word here is the imperative give. So you have Israel, the beginning of the verse, ends in Israel. You have the word give, and if you notice, in the Masoretic text, that's exactly what happens. So here, and Saul said to the Lord God of Israel, all that text is gone. That's the word give. So you notice, beginning of the verse, same phrase that's used in the Septuagint, the same phrase that's used in the Greek. Then there was a whole bunch of text here that we don't see, and then the word give. And it's because the eye skipped from Israel in the Hebrew down to Israel at the end of that long sentence and deleted everything. Okay, so we've looked at the unintentional errors that crept into the text because of the human nature of the scribes, right? And you can see that deletions or accidentally adding text or switching letters around, this is all stuff that you can anticipate happening, or hearing the wrong letter based on the wrong sound. Tomorrow, we're going to start looking at the intentional changes that were made by the scribes, which led to variation in the various manuscripts. So stay tuned and keep with us here on our textual criticism journey of the Hebrew Bible and the Greek New Testament. Thanks. Welcome back, everyone, to Textual Criticism of the Old and New Testaments. Today we're going to be venturing into the intentional changes that were made by the scribe. We're going to do this in two parts. Again, we're utilizing the information that's in Paul Wagner's A Student's Guide to Textual Criticism of the Bible, and it's a great book. I suggest that you get it if you're interested in the topic. So let's jump into it. We're going to look at changes to spelling and grammar, resolving difficulties in the text, and finally harmonizing between different passages. So keep this in mind. These, we think, are intentional changes that they've made to the texts. In other words, they thought to themselves, I'm going to change X to Y. Sometimes they were right in the change, sometimes they weren't. So just because it's an intentional change doesn't mean that it's not an error. So just keep that in mind as we go through it. So one of the things that was done was that scribes would attempt at times to replace archaic or older archaic forms with forms that would be understood better by the reader. So in Psalm 11:1, k, the kaf here, this means like or as. This is the normal way of writing it, or the more common way. But there's a more poetic form, kmo, which is a longer form. It's perhaps older, archaic. And this form, either the scribe didn't realize what it was, or was unfamiliar with it in some way, to the point that he thought that the kaf and mem here represented your. This is a suffix. At any rate, what happened is he thought that this was in error, and so he changed the sentence. He changed the original reading, which was, flee to the mountain like a bird, to flee to your mountain, a bird. There are difficulties that the scribes would attempt to resolve by modifying the text to make something clearer. So in Isaiah 39:1, we have the word chazak. And chazak usually means to be strong or to become strong. But in an extended sense, it can mean to get well or to recover, which makes sense, but it just doesn't happen all that often. So in the passage, instead of saying chazak, to get well, the scribe replaced that with a more common word, chaya, which means to get well. So that was an intentional change to resolve a difficulty in the passage that didn't seem to make sense with the word chazak. In the New Testament, in Mark 1:2-3, these are two verses that utilize quotes, as the New Testament does at times, from two different passages in the Old Testament. So here, these two verses are a composite of Isaiah 40, verse 3, and Malachi 3, verse 1. But the earlier manuscripts attribute it simply to Isaiah. So it says, as the prophet Isaiah said, and then it quotes from both places. Well, of course, this presented the difficulty to the scribe, who realized that only one of those quotes came from Isaiah. So then that was amended. Here, this Greek is the older Greek, or the Greek of the older manuscripts, by Isaiah the prophet. It was amended to read by the prophets in general, as opposed to Isaiah, so that it would actually make sense in the context. So resolving a difficulty, changing the text. Harmonization, modifying a passage to make it agree with another passage. So, in John 19, verses 19 and 20, we read, "And Pilate wrote an inscription also, and put it on the cross, as it is written, quote, Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews." And at the end of verse 20, it was written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. Well, in Luke 23, some manuscripts, following the sentence, "Now there was also an inscription above him, this is the King of the Jews," insert this underlined phrase, "It was written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek." This is taking two passages that are accounts of the same incident and trying to harmonize them. This sort of thing happens when the scribe perhaps knows of another text that reads a similar way and tries to bring that information in to make the texts stand in harmony with one another. So these are intentional changes. So that's part one. Tune in tomorrow for intentional changes part 2, as we see the other intentional changes that the scribes tended to make. Hi everybody. Welcome to Textual Criticism of the Old and New Testaments, Intentional Changes part 2. So, we looked at intentional changes, the first half of them yesterday. Let's get into the rest of them now. So there are euphemisms that appear in the text where words are changed to sort of soften the meaning, make it easier to read in a psychological sense perhaps. Theological changes that took place, and intentional additions or glosses that were added to the text. So euphemisms. This is replacing a term or a phrase that is considered offensive or inappropriate. So in the exercise that I did with my class, there was a phrase that I put in there that said, "What the hell is up with this weather?" Some of them had a euphemistic change, and they said, "What's up with this weather?" Taking out and replacing that phrase, changing it to make it less or more appropriate, less offensive. This happens a lot in the Old Testament text with the replacement of the word Baal, which means Lord, but is also the name of a deity that was in competition, you might say, with Yahweh. So Baal is often replaced with Boshet or Bosheth, which means shame. So in 2 Samuel 4:4, you can see the Bosheth there at the end. But in the Septuagint, it's preserved as his name was Mephi-Baal. And, of course, you see the end of the word on each of those, Bosheth replacing Baal, to make it less offensive. There are theological changes that are made to the text. These were often made because God was mentioned in an inappropriate way, at least to the scribe. So in Genesis 2:2, and God finished his work which he had done on the seventh day. The Septuagint has, and God finished his works which he had done on the sixth day. If you know the text, God rests on the seventh day. So this was inappropriate to God's work. And so it looks like the text was amended to the sixth day to make it theologically correct. Finally, additions and glosses. So these are generally explanatory additions or notes that clarify the text. So in Genesis 7:6, you have Hamabul haya mayim al haaretz, which means, and the flood was water upon the earth. Well, Hamabul means the flood, and of course we know when we see that in English what that means, but Mabul was a term that may not have been entirely understood. So this addition, haya mayim al haaretz, was water upon the earth, may have been an addition or a gloss that explained what the Mabul was. In Luke 24:53, the verse ends with Amen or Amen in several manuscripts, and this appears to have been added thinking that this addition was appropriate for the end of the book, and so this was added to the text to make it correct in their eyes. So, that's it. As a final thought, Wegner points out, and we wanted to emphasize, that intentional changes are much more difficult to ascertain because unintentional errors tend to follow a particular pattern. So if you think back to something like haplography, where the eye skips over something and deletes the portion of the text, you can sort of predict that in a sense. You can look back and see, oh, I see how they did that. It's more difficult to do that with intentional changes because they may be less obvious, and you might be able to argue, well, how do you know that's just not how it was originally? And that's true. So it's more difficult to determine if something is intentional. However, as you go through as a text critic, you need to be open at least to the possibility that a change is intentional, and that intentional change can be understood in a way that explains how a particular reading came to stand as it was. So, tomorrow, we're going to get into the transmission of the biblical texts, and this should help us understand the general history of how the texts were transmitted, both the Old and the New Testaments. So, join us for that. Welcome back, everyone, to Textual Criticism, the series that we've been going through for the past couple of weeks. Today we are moving into the Hebrew Bible specifically, and we're going to take a look at the sources that we have for the Hebrew Bible, beginning with probably the most important, the Masoretic text, and we're going to do this in several parts. So let's get started. We're going to take a look at what the Masoretic text is in general, the importance of the consonants as opposed to the vowels, and when those two things came into being, at least in their written form, the number of manuscripts that are in this group called the Masoretic text, and the significance of the MT. So, what is the Masoretic text? Masoretic text is given its name from the Masorah that was eventually transmitted with the Hebrew text. So if you remember, the Masorah, well, I'll show you in just a second, its primary development came in the 10th century with the Ben Asher family. This portion represents the main text. Over here and down here, however, we have notes, things that were added to, insights, things that were counted, the Qere and Ketiv, all of these things show up in the Masorah. And so this is what was transmitted later with the main text of the Hebrew Bible. So, the Masoretic text gets its name from this Masorah that was transmitted, and it was firmly developed in the 10th century. What is the Masoretic text? Well, strictly speaking, it refers to the Ben Asher tradition. The problem is that when we say that, we often refer to the Masoretic text as not speaking strictly about the Ben Asher tradition. We're talking about all the manuscripts in the Masoretic text. So it's a little bit of a misnomer to just call it the Masoretic text. The other thing is it's not strictly one text. So there's not one manuscript somewhere, one codex or something that we look at and we say, aha, this is the Masoretic text. And it's a family, a group of manuscripts that follow this tradition, this Masoretic text tradition. So it's more appropriate to, as Tov does, call it the Masoretic texts, plural, or the group or family of the Masoretic texts. So, consonants versus vowels. The Hebrew text was originally only consonants. So if you look here, so if you see the little dashes, the dots that are underneath of those strange-looking larger characters, those are the vowels and the accent marks. They usually show up, the vowels at least, usually show up underneath of the consonants. The larger text, just above that blue line, those are the consonants. So originally, if you notice, there are no vowel points. There are no accent marks. This is the Qumran scroll 1Q Isaiah A, the great Isaiah scroll. This is chapter 53. But if you notice, there are no marks underneath or above the text. It's only the consonants. So this is originally how Hebrew was written. These consonants form the base of the Masoretic text, and they come from the Second Temple period. So, the late 6th century until the fall of the Second Temple, 70 CE. This consonantal text became authoritative to the Jewish community by the 2nd century CE. So the thing that we want to realize here, that the point if you want to take something home, is that the consonants were there, not the vowels. Right? So that doesn't mean that there weren't vowels being pronounced, it's just they didn't write them. So what we see in something like BHS, what we've been putting up on the screen, this is another tradition, a later part of the Masoretic tradition, where these vowel points were added, and there are different systems of vowel points that were added throughout time in different Hebrew traditions. So we need to keep that in mind. We call this consonantal base Proto-Masoretic because it doesn't have the Masorah, and it's the foundation of what the Masoretic text tradition was built upon, and so we call it Proto-Masoretic. How many manuscripts are there? Well, over 6,000. That would be considered part of the Masoretic text family. The print editions of the Hebrew Bible are based on the MT. Now, the significance of the MT. Well, I already mentioned that the Jewish community viewed the Masoretic text as authoritative by the 2nd century CE. Tov stresses that just because the MT had a great significance in this early community, it does not follow that it contains the best or the original readings. Just because this textual tradition was authoritative in a way that other traditions were not, does not mean that it necessarily contains the best readings. So the Septuagint, the Syriac Peshitta, some of these other sources, the Latin Vulgate, they may contain better readings. You can't just say that because the Masoretic textual tradition was authoritative to the early Jewish community that means that it contains the original or the best readings. Tomorrow we're going to continue and we're going to look at the first of the 3 periods of transmission of the Masoretic text. Welcome back everyone to part 2 of the Masoretic text tradition. Here in this series on textual criticism, again we're using Emmanuel Tov's textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible. And we're looking at the second part of the transmission of the Masoretic text. So let's get started. We're going to look first at what the 3 periods are, then discuss the first period in a little bit of detail, and pick up tomorrow and Monday on the second and third periods. So, what are the 3 periods of transmission of the MT? Well, they're broadly the Second Temple period, from 78 or 70 CE when the temple fell into the 8th century, and then from the 8th century to the end of the Middle Ages. So right in the middle of the second millennium. So these are the three periods of transmission of the MT. They each have somewhat distinctive features, and we're going to talk about the first period today. So the first period has an unclear beginning. So, what happened in the latter portion of the first millennium, again, is not easily ascertainable, but we do know that at some point the Masoretic textual tradition started to come together, and it ends with the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. The Qumran scrolls that range from 250 BCE to 68 CE are a significant source during this first period. The scrolls from Masada, where the revolt had its last stand, which took place, these were compiled, written, copied before 73 CE, so they fit this first period well. At Masada, we have portions of Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Ezekiel, and the Psalms. And then finally, the last source are the ancient translations, and we'll talk about these in more detail in a later video. What is the character of the first period? So it's a broad range of time, and it's an unclear period of time from a historical aspect. We don't know as much about it as we would like. What we do know is that even though the text was coming together, the tradition was coming together, it still is very consistent in its copies, at least in the Masoretic family. So there are many small differences between the manuscripts, but they're usually words or phrases. And so a good example of this is Qumran. So if we look at Qumran Isaiah, it's very close to the Leningrad Codex Isaiah, which is from 1008, 1009 CE. So if we look at, for example, the comparison between 1Q Isaiah B, which has portions of 46 chapters of the book of Isaiah, and Codex Leningradensis, we see some of the differences, and these are listed out by Tov. I've just pulled a couple of them here. Differences in orthographies, 107. There could be the addition or the deletion of the conjunction vav. So 29 times that happened. In these 46 chapters we're describing here, different numbers were used 14 times. Differences in grammatical forms occurs 24 times. Different words altogether 11 times. These aren't all of the differences, but this is sort of the way that it went. Over 46 chapters, this is fairly consistent. And so we know that even though they perhaps weren't as meticulous as the later Masoretes were, they were still very careful about their copying, and there were people that were checking and overseeing the transmission of the text. So this sort of sums up the first period. Notice the big things. It's basically the Second Temple period, at least the latter part of the Second Temple period. The sources are Qumran, Masada, and the ancient translations, and the character is relatively consistent. You have people in the Temple of Jerusalem that are responsible for checking the transmission, the copying of these texts, and there's a high degree of consistency between the texts that were at Qumran and the Leningrad Codex. So tomorrow we're going to look at the second period of transmission, which runs from 70 CE to about the 8th century, and we'll look at some of the particulars of that second period of transmission of the Masoretic text. Welcome back to part 3 of Textual Criticism, Sources for the Hebrew Bible, and we're looking at the Masoretic text. So today we're going to look at the second period of transmission of the Masoretic text, what the sources are for it, and the character, the overall nature of the transmission during that period. So let's get right into it. We looked at the first period yesterday, and it essentially covered at least the latter portion of the Second Temple period. Maybe earlier, it's hard to tell. The beginning is unclear. But it ended with the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. Well, that's where period 2 picks up. Go figure. from the destruction of the Second Temple to about the 8th century. So what were the texts transmitted like? How were they copied? And what the sources are all come from that period. So what are the sources? Well, they come primarily from the beginning and the end of the period. From the early portion, we have the Judean desert texts, including Nachal Hever, which has Genesis, Numbers, and Psalms, fragments from those books or sections, and Wadi Murabba'at, with the Torah, Isaiah, and the minor prophets. Now, later in the period, we have the Cairo Geniza, which Geniza is a storeroom, and these texts, they were religious texts, many of them. When they were copied and they came out or they fell out of use, they couldn't be destroyed. The belief was that they couldn't be destroyed, and so they were placed in a Geniza, if at all possible, in a storeroom. And so from this, we have recovered tens of thousands of biblical fragments. So other sources from the second period of transmission, we have several Targumim, we have the Syriac Peshitta, various recensions of the Septuagint, so Aquila, Symmachus, the fifth column of Origen's Hexapla, and also the Latin Vulgate. Now, what is the character of the second period of transmission? The textual evidence from this second period of transmission reflects the tradition of the Masoretic text. So all of the sources seem to reflect the Masoretic textual tradition. The choice of the MT over other traditions, however, does not indicate its superiority for textual criticism. So we can't say that just because the sources in this period utilize more and more or reflect the Masoretic textual tradition that somehow the MT is closer to the original or is a better source for textual criticism. That's not necessarily the case. It just meant that it was authoritative for the Jewish community and that it was copied because of that. So we need to keep that in mind as we do textual criticism. So tomorrow, finally, we will get to the third period of transmission, which will take us to the end of the Middle Ages, and we'll look at how the Masoretic tradition was standardized, formalized, with all of its accompanying vocalizations and vowel patterns, all these other things. Join us tomorrow for the third period of transmission, the Masoretic text. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Textual Criticism. We're looking at the sources for the Hebrew Bible, continuing this series with the Masoretic text. We're on part 4, and we're looking specifically today at the third period of transmission. So let's get into it. We're going to look at this third period of transmission, the sources that are involved in it, and the character of the third period. So, as by way of review, the first period consisted of essentially the Second Temple period. We don't know when it began precisely during the Second Temple period, but it runs through the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. And from 70 CE into the 8th century is roughly the second period of transmission for the Masoretic text. And then today we're going to be talking about the last section, the 8th century through the end of the Middle Ages, roughly the middle of the second millennium CE. So the sources for the third period, you have them divided essentially into two periods, the pre-1100 period, which are considered the early sources, and then the later, the 11 to approximately 1500 sources. So the earlier sources tend to be more reliable, but as time goes by, these texts become more and more standardized. Codex in Cairo, the Aleppo Codex, and so on. We'll talk about those tomorrow in a bit more detail. So what is the character of the third period? And this is where I'm going to spend some time today. By this point, the Masoretic text is almost completely standardized. You have additional elements that have been added to the text, and they become finalized during this period. So the Masorah, the vocalization, the cantillation marks, and the divisions in the text. And so let's take a look at each of these. By way of review, we've talked about the Masorah a number of times, but the Masoretic text is given its name from the Masorah that was eventually transmitted with the Hebrew text. Its primary development came in the 10th century with the Ben Asher family. This is the book of Joshua, and you notice here highlighted in yellow, this is the main Hebrew text that was transmitted. But then over here in the margin, and just underneath of the main body text is the Masorah. So these are the notes, the references that the Masoretes transmitted along with the consonantal text, and eventually its pointings that we're going to talk about today. But these are the notes that were transmitted alongside and below. Now, vocalization, and this is something that's important for us to realize. The vocalization was a system of marks and pointing that made it clear which words were intended by the consonants and how they were to be pronounced. So if you remember, the Hebrew text was consonantal in the Proto-Masoretic period and through most of its transmission. But during this period in particular, the vocalization, these points, these marks, were added around the consonantal text in a way that was systematized. And these indicated how the Masoretes were how they understood the individual words. So let's take a look at an example here. So if you look at these consonants, Dalet, Bet, Resh, these are the consonants. But and the points that you see in addition are the vowel points. So this is an I vowel. This is a long E vowel. These are both long A vowels. That's a long A and a short A. These are two short E's. That's a long O and a short E. So these are points you can see they're added around the consonants, right? Now you notice the consonants are the same all the way through. Now depending on the vowels that you add, you can change the meaning of the word in its entirety. So for example, diber is he said. Davar is a word, the noun. Davar is he said. This is a different verbal form, a different binyan. Dever, which is pestilence, the noun for pestilence, and then dover, which is the word for pasture. So you can see, based on the variation in the vowel pointing, this can mean very different words. But I want to bring home the point, no pun intended, that these vowel points can change the meaning of the word. And so by adding these points, it made it clear to the reader what was being intended by the text. Cantillation marks. These are additional marks that were also added to the text. They're not vowels. They denote several things. One, where the stress goes on the syllable. Two, they show syntactical relationships between the various words and phrases. And then three, they give musical information. So I'll show you here in just a second. So if you look, here's another view close up of the text. And if you look here, these are vowel sounds here, here, here. But this little /, that's a cantillation mark. This one here is a cantillation mark. This is a cantillation mark. Here's another one here, cantillation mark here. Notice here, here, here. This is a cantillation mark. This one is. So these are additional marks that are not part of the vowels, and they show you where the stress is. So for here, v, ki, na would be the syllable that has the stress because that's where the cantillation mark is. Dimo, na is na, that's where the stress would be here. The da would be where the stress is here. The kedesh, so notice the accent would be back here. Chatzor, the accent would be here. Anyway, so they show syllable stress. They also show relationships of words. So for example, here, these two syllable or cantillation marks, notice how they kind of point toward each other. That means that these go together. Same thing here. These two go together syntactically. So they show relationships, how they understood these words to go together. And then finally, they give musical information. So I can't believe I'm getting ready to say this, but I studied cantillation marks for a while and learned to sing some of them. So you actually sing the stress. You sing the cantillation mark. So in Genesis 1, you would sing Bareshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz And those cantillation marks tell you where you should put the stress and what notes you should sing based on those marks. So divisions in the text, without going into a whole lot of detail here to be somewhat confusing, even though it may have already happened, there were divisions that were placed in the text by the Masoretes specifically to show the beginning of a new topic, to divide that new topic into subtopics, and then to denote individual verses. Now, in the 13th century, chapters were added in England but in a manuscript of the Latin Vulgate, and these chapters were brought over in the transmission of the text later on. But this is an interpretive thing. Of course, all of these things are interpretive. These are things added to the consonantal text to make more sense. But again, they're interpretive, and certainly chapter division was interpretive. So this is not something that was there all along. So keep that in mind as a text critic, that the chapter divisions were not added until much later. Okay, tomorrow what we're going to do is look in particular at some of the more important medieval manuscripts, the sources for the Masoretic tradition, and try to give them a bit of a description so that you can understand when we actually go to practice textual criticism, you understand some of the sources in a bit more detail. Okay, see you tomorrow. Hello again, everyone. Welcome to Textual Criticism of the Hebrew Bible, the Masoretic text, Part 5. Today we're going to be looking at some of the medieval sources that we utilize when we reconstruct the Hebrew text, and we're going to be using Ernst Werthwein's The Text of the Old Testament, an Introduction to the Biblia Hebraica, 3rd edition. So let's get started. The sources that we're going to look at are Codex Cairensis, Codex Aleppo, Codex Leningradensis, Codex Sassoon 1053, Codex Oriental MS 4445, and Codex Babylonicus Petropolitanus. So, Codex Cairensis, dated to 895 CE, and it contains the former and the latter prophets, so Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and the minor prophets. As you can see, it contains a fair amount of the Hebrew text. Codex Aleppo is another significant source, dated to 900 to 925 CE. It contains much of the Old Testament text, except for the Torah. So you can see Chronicles, Psalms, Job, Proverbs, Ruth, Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, and Nehemiah. But, of course, the Torah is not present, but again, a significant manuscript for reconstructing the Hebrew text. Codex Leningradensis, dated to 1008 CE. This is the text that is the complete, it's a complete copy of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and it's the basis for Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia because of that. So you can see if you look here at the text on the side, it looks remarkably consistent with what we've been looking at when we copy and paste portions of our BHS for examples. So this is Codex Leningradensis. Codex Sassoon 1053 is dated to the 10th century, and it is also a nearly complete text of the Hebrew Bible. Some portions missing, but as you can see, very well preserved. Codex Oriental MS 4445 is dated to the 9th to 10th centuries, and it contains the Torah. Finally, Codex Babylonicus Petropolitanus is dated to 916 CE, and it contains the latter prophets. So I know I've kind of moved through this quickly, trying to keep this video short. These are just some of the major sources, major manuscripts that we use from the Middle Ages, from this third period of transmission of the Masoretic text. These are sources that are either from the Ben Asher family or from the Ben Naphtali family. But here, these are the primary sources that we use for reconstructing the Masoretic text from the late Middle Ages. So, tomorrow we're going to move on from the Masoretic text, and we're going to start looking at another significant source for the Hebrew text, and that is the Samaritan Pentateuch. So please stay tuned for that. See you tomorrow. Welcome back, everyone, to our series on textual criticism. We have been working our way through the Hebrew Bible, and we just finished up the short series on the Masoretic text family. Now we're moving into some of the other major sources that we utilize in Old Testament textual criticism. And today we're going to take a look at the Samaritan Pentateuch. And again, we're working with Emmanuel Tov's textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible, from which we're getting much of our information. So please use that. It's a valuable resource. So today we're going to look at what the Samaritan Pentateuch is, its origin, and it's the earliest manuscript that we have, and then finally the general character of the text. So what is the Samaritan Pentateuch? Well, it's the Hebrew text of the Pentateuch preserved by the Samaritan community. It is a consonantal text, so it, generally speaking, does not have vowel pointing. The Samaritan community did have some vowel pointing that it used sporadically, but generally speaking, no. And you can see it off to the right there. It has a special script, and let's look at it a little more closely. This isn't the greatest picture in the world, but you can see the script. If you know Hebrew, it looks like Paleo-Hebrew script. So when we consider the origin of the Samaritan Pentateuch and the earliest manuscript that we have of it, we see that the origin is unclear. So in some ways, like the Masoretic text tradition, we don't know exactly when it started. So the script that is used has been thought to be very ancient, as it looks like it's Paleo-Hebrew script, but as it turns out, we can date the script, at least with some degree of certainty, to the Hasmonean dynasty, so the 2nd century BCE. So it's relatively late in that sense, or perhaps a better way to say it is it's no earlier, no more ancient than the other sources that we have. The earliest manuscript that we actually have, though, comes from the Middle Ages. So manuscript ADD, 1846, comes from the 12th century CE. So, this is what we know of the origin, and this is the earliest manuscript that we have. Now, what is the general character of the text? Well, early on there was much more freedom on the part of the scribes to amend the Hebrew text. So there was harmonizing, linguistic corrections. They would change the content, the morphology, the vocabulary. They didn't change it substantially, but they did feel much more free than they did later to change the text. And they had ideological changes. So, for example, Jerusalem is often replaced with Mount Gerizim, which makes sense for the Samaritans. So that's the Samaritan Pentateuch. I know we went through that kind of quickly, but essentially what you should take away from the Samaritan Pentateuch is that it's another source, another tradition of a substantial portion of the Hebrew Bible, and it was transmitted separately, and so it's another witness that we have to the Hebrew text, and another tool that we can use to try to reconstruct what was originally put down in the Hebrew autograph. So tomorrow we're going to start looking at the text from Qumran. Yay! So tune in for that and see what kind of manuscripts came out of the Judean desert. See you tomorrow. Well, welcome back, everyone, to our series on textual criticism. Today we are continuing through the Hebrew Bible, and we're starting with the very important set of texts that were discovered in the Judean desert, the text of Qumran. So today we'll give an introduction to the text from Qumran. So what are the texts that were discovered at Qumran? What was their discovery like, at least what we think? What texts were found there, and how they're cited when people refer to them. So, in 1947, near Khirbet Qumran, as the story goes, 15 miles south of Jericho, which is right about here, there was a shepherd who was wandering around these caves and threw a stone into one of the caves and was surprised when he heard a cracking sound of a clay jar. And when he went to investigate, he found these clay pots, clay jars that contained biblical and non-biblical manuscripts. in Hebrew. So in total, there were 11 caves containing thousands of fragments of biblical and non-biblical texts. Now, what texts were found there? Well, over 200 biblical scrolls. All books of the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, are represented except for the books of Esther and Nehemiah. However, Ezra and Nehemiah were one book, and so Ezra was found, so it's entirely possible that Nehemiah was represented as well, just not preserved. The most popular books that are found at Qumran are the books of Deuteronomy, Isaiah, and the Psalms, and to a lesser extent, Genesis and Exodus. 12 of the scrolls were written in this Paleo-Hebrew script. This is what it looks like. This is the Misha inscription, and we'll probably talk about this at some point in the future, but 12 scrolls were written in this style, this Paleo-Hebrew style. During your work as a text critic, when you see the text cited from Qumran, you can identify them and understand what the citation means if you understand how they refer to these texts. So, they refer to the number, first the number of the cave in which the scroll was found or the text fragment was found. Then they provide a letter, Q for Qumran, MAS for Masada, MUR for Murabbaat, which I've spelled wrong there. Sorry, there's an A missing after the second B. I can't believe I pointed that out anyway. And Hev for Hever. Then the name of the biblical book is provided, followed by the number of the copies. So if they found the book of Isaiah in one scroll, they'd call that A, and then if they found another Isaiah, they'd call that B, and then if they found a third, they'd call it C, and so forth. Finally, if one of the scrolls is in that Paleo-Hebrew script, they will write Paleo in the name. So, for example, I probably should have put this first, but oh well. 1Q Isaiah A would be, it was found in Cave 1. The Q represents Qumran, so it was found at Qumran. It's the biblical book of Isaiah, and it was the first scroll of Isaiah that they found. So 1Q Isaiah A. So if it was 1Q Isaiah B, it would be the second Isaiah scroll that was found. If it were 1Q Paleo Isaiah A, then it would be Isaiah that was written in this Paleo-Hebrew script. So there you go. Tomorrow we're going to look at the dating of the Qumran text, try to get a feel for when these texts were written, their antiquity, and will give us an idea of their usefulness for textual criticism. So tune in tomorrow to hear about the dating of the Qumran texts. Thanks. Welcome back, everyone, to Textual Criticism. This is a continuation of the series, The Sources of the Hebrew Bible. Today we're looking at part 2 of the text from Qumran, and we're going to be looking at the date of the Qumran texts, their publication, and the 5 types of text that can be found at Qumran. So radiocarbon dating, carbon-14, has dated these texts to approximately 2,000 years old. For example, 1Q Isaiah A was dated between 202 and 107 BCE. On paleographic grounds, the shape and the stance of the letters, that same manuscript, 1Q Isaiah A, was dated between 125 and 100, so you can see the overlap, verifying the accuracy of the date. The texts were published in the Discoveries in the Judean Desert, or DJD. Volume 1 came out in 1955. There are also many online resources. A quick Google search will show you a number of them. The Dead Sea Scrolls Digital Library, the Digital Dead Sea Scrolls. If you have a program like BibleWorks, they'll have a link to an online resource. So there are many things out there that you can get a hold of the Qumran texts. Now, the 5 types of text that can be found at Qumran begin with the text written in the Qumran practice, and that is text that, based on their orthography, morphology, general scribal practice, were identified as having been written at Qumran. And those texts make up approximately 20% of the overall biblical texts that are there. Secondly, you have the Proto-Masoretic texts, so the consonantal framework of the MT, for example, 1Q Isaiah A, These make up approximately 35% of the biblical texts at the site. The pre-Samaritan texts represent the texts upon which the Samaritan Pentateuch was based. These make up approximately 5% of the biblical texts of the Torah there at the site. The fourth group of texts are those that are close to the presumed Hebrew source for the Septuagint. So the Hebrew texts that presumably form the basis of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. So for example, 4Q Jeremiah B and 4Q Jeremiah D, their arrangement as far as the verses and the shorter text, these characteristics closely resemble the Septuagint. So these texts make up approximately 5% of the Qumran biblical texts. Finally, there's the non-aligned group. So these texts are not indicative. They don't fit in with any of the four that went before that we've discussed here, but they agree with the MT. Some agree with the MT, others with the Septuagint, others still with the Samaritan Pentateuch. This is sort of a catch-all group there at Qumran, and it represents approximately 35% of the total Qumran evidence, including the liturgical sources. Now, tomorrow we're going to finish up Qumran by looking at the significance of the Qumran text, particularly as it pertains to textual criticism. So stay with us. Good afternoon, everyone. A new week, another week of textual criticism. I promise we're drawing to a close on the Hebrew Bible. I want to go through the translations, maybe another thing or two, and then talk about how to actually apply all of these principles that we've been learning about in the practice of textual criticism. Then we'll move on to the New Testament, and then to something else. You guys do seem to be enjoying it, though, so I don't feel too bad. Anyhow, today we're going to be looking at the ancient translations and introduction. Now, I said on Friday that I would talk about the usefulness of the Qumran manuscripts, and I got to thinking about it. A whole daily data on the usefulness of ancient Hebrew texts in the light of a textual criticism series doesn't seem terribly useful. It's a little redundant. So I think all of us probably understand the usefulness of Hebrew manuscripts that appear 1,000 years earlier than the sources that we had before 1947. So moving on to translations. So what are ancient translations? We're going to talk a little bit about that, what it actually means. Not the specific ones, but what it means. Then I've labeled point 2 KJV or NIV-ish. So I'll talk about that in a minute, but how did they translate? And that's sort of what I'm getting at there. It'll become clear when I get to that point. Anyway, then point 3, the various translations. What are they? Then what we're going to do is this week we're going to look at the actual translations a day at a time so that we can kind of get an idea. The Septuagint might take more than one daily data, I'm not sure. But anyhow, that's what we're going to do. Take them one at a time so that we can understand the individual sources. So, what are ancient translations? Well, a translation, of course, is taking the linguistic content of a source language, of one language, and bringing it into another language. So translation is a fun but can be very difficult process, and one has to make decisions when one translates to figure out what they're going to bring over and how they're going to bring it over. So when we're talking about the ancient translations, we're talking about the translation of the Hebrew Bible into other more common languages, more common to the period. Each of these translations would have been based ostensibly on a Hebrew text, and we call that a Vorlage. So that's the basis, the Hebrew basis. So the Septuagint, for example, in Jeremiah, had a different Vorlage than the MT, and we know that based on certain translational characteristics. Maybe we'll talk about those in a later video. But that's the text. When we say a different Vorlage, we're talking about that Hebrew text that the translator originally translated from. Now, KJV-ish or NIV-ish. So I just wanted to look at a couple of passages to make my point clear. Here in Job 26:10, and I apologize somewhat with my tongue in my cheek up front to those listening that are KJV onlyists. I'd love to have you on the show to hear why you are a KJV onlyist, so email me, digitalhammurabi@gmail.com, or message us on Twitter. And if you want to come on and talk to me about why you hold to a KJV only position, particularly given all this textual criticism stuff we're talking about, love to have you on and talk to you a little bit about it. Anyway, but the King James Version has, he hath compassed the waters with bounds until the day and night come to an end. Super clear. Whereas the NIV says, he marks out the horizon on the face of the waters for a boundary between light and darkness. Now, the two translators here are taking the Hebrew text and they're translating it differently. Of course, the KJV has very old English, which is not nearly as clear to the modern reader. But the NIV tends to have a more, what's a good word? Dynamic is the way we would say it, but a more, what is the text actually trying to relay? So there's more of a paraphrastic isn't quite right, but type of translation where they're trying to get at what the text is saying, not giving a literal or a word for word necessarily translation of the text from the Hebrew. And this is seen, I think, somewhat clearly here in Job 26:10. Another passage where we see this sort of comparison would be, see, look, Metathus is there, KVJ. You see, all of us, all you great text critics out there saw that and immediately said, well, we know what the scribe did. You see, Metathus is. Anyway, so KJV. So if we were, just to harp on that a little bit longer, if we were to 1,000 years from now look at this, we wouldn't say, given the context here, if we go back to the previous slide, KJV there, NIV underneath, then KVJ here in NIV, we would not postulate that there was another version that I was using called the Keeping Validity Jovial translation, right? We would say, oh, that's Metathesis, and we get that based on context. Anyway, that probably wasn't funny in any way. Moving on. Will a man leave the snow of Lebanon, which cometh from the rock of the field? That makes sense. Or the cold flowing waters that come from another place be forsaken? Now, if you don't know what that means, I don't know what to do, because that's super clear. The NIV says, does the snow of Lebanon ever vanish from its rocky slopes? Do its cool waters from distant sources ever stop flowing? Now, there's more complexity here than just how you bring this over into the Hebrew. There's some contextual issues, but the point is that, or some textual issues, but the point is that the KJV is bringing this over in a more wooden, perhaps, way. They're trying to make sense of it, but the NIV is paraphrasing far more, or it's being more liberal in its translation. And the reason is that they're trying to bring across what the text actually means, if that makes sense. So we have these issues when we look at modern-day translations and when we, of course, look at these ancient translations. So when you look at the Septuagint, for example, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, you have to consider the exegesis, what came from the text linguistically when they translated from the Hebrew to the Greek or to the Latin or to the Syriac or whatever. First of all, you have to consider that the translator had to look at these consonants, this consonantal text, and figure out what words do these consonants represent. Now that seems sort of silly unless you've been watching these videos. If you remember that slide that talks about Dalet Beit Resh, if it says diber, it means one thing. If it says davar, it means another thing. If it's davar with comments in patach, then it means another thing on down the line. So the vowel pointing can change, right? And it can change the meaning. So the translator has to say, first of all, what words or what word does this consonant or do these consonants represent? Once they figure out what the individual words are, they can then ask the question, well, what do these words, how do these words go together? What's their syntactical relationship? Which words go in which phrase? Sometimes that's not always clear. Then, once they figure out what it says in Hebrew, they have to say, okay, I know what it says in Hebrew. What word most closely identifies that in Greek? If they're doing the Septuagint translation. Let's take a different example. The word agape in Greek, we would translate as love, right? But there are several different words in Greek for love. And so how do we just say love for all three of them? Do we try to nuance it to give a clearer meaning? Do we, as the next point would say, explain the text with the word agape? For example, if someone wants to translate agape as some type of unconditional love, or a stronger love than, one of the other Greek words, then maybe they would put a gloss, or they would use more than one word, like unconditional love, right? That's an additional word that it's trying to bring across the meaning, not necessarily giving a wooden translation. So which word should I use to translate this word? And of course, there are synonyms in language, and so you can bring different words across that can be misunderstood later because different words have a different range of meaning. And if someone reading a translation later assumes a different range of meaning or a different part of the range of meaning for a word, that can cause confusion. So this is just one of the basic principles of communication linguistically. It's difficult to bring that which is signified into another language. So finally, should I explain the text? That's another question the translator has to ask and did ask. So for example, in Isaiah 6:3, Kadosh, 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 holy, holy, holy. We know linguistically here, syntactically, that the repetition of an adjective like that, holy, 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 is an intensifier. And generally speaking, you don't see words repeated 3 times. You will sometimes see them repeated twice. 3 times it's more significant, right? So it's trying to say extraordinarily holy, right? But do you say extraordinarily holy is the Lord of hosts and try to explain it? Or do you say holy, 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 and then explain it from the pulpit, right, or from the commentary? These are decisions that translators had to make, and we still make them today. Do we go with a wooden translation and explain it somewhere else, or do we try to explain what the passage is saying or what the words are saying in the translation itself? These are difficulties, and they can lead to confusion or clarity. So, what are the various translations that we see in antiquity based on the Hebrew text? Well, first, the Septuagint, the Greek text, and its revisions, which we'll talk about beginning tomorrow. The Targumim, or the Targums, these are Aramaic. They follow the MT pretty closely, generally speaking. They can be a little more interpretive, but these are the Aramaic translations of the Hebrew text. Then the Syriac Peshitta, distinguished from the other Peshitta, which we'll talk about when we get there. This is in Syriac. And then finally, the Latin Vulgate. There is an Arabic translation, but I'm just going to stick to these 4 because I think they're probably used more frequently and more commonly. So, okay, tomorrow we're going to get into the Septuagint, the Greek translation, and try to explain what the Old Greek is as opposed to the Recensions, so that we can have a better understanding of the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. So stay tuned. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the next part in our series on textual criticism. We're looking at the ancient translations of the Hebrew Bible, and today we're beginning to look at the Greek Septuagint. Again, as a reminder, we're using Emmanuel Tov's Textual Criticism of the Hebrew Bible, And again, it's an excellent resource. Please refer to it as our information is being derived from it. So let's get started. So what is the Septuagint? We're going to talk about that in general. We're going to look at its contents and its early compilation. And then finally, the types of witnesses that we have to the Septuagint. So what is this thing? Well, it's the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And while there is some debate concerning when the translation took place, we think it probably was sometime in the 3rd century, at least with the Torah being translated into Greek, and in the centuries following, the remainder of the Septuagint being translated, the remainder of the Hebrew Bible being translated. The thing to remember text critically is that its source was distinct from the source for the MT, the Targums, the Syriac, and the Vulgate. So it's a very important witness to the Hebrew Bible because it's ostensibly a different Vorlage, as we talked about earlier. The New Testament, the early church quoted from and or used the Septuagint. So you see it in New Testament text, quoting Old Testament passages. The church fathers quoting from the Septuagint. So it's a very important text. Tradition has it that it was named for the 70 or sometimes 72 elders that translated it, and thus if you see the Roman numerals LXX, that's the Septuagint for 70. So what are its contents? Well, it contains the 24 books of the Old Testament canon, the Apocrypha, which consists of the Greek translations of Hebrew books that we no longer have, and books that were originally composed in Greek. We should be careful to distinguish between the Old Greek, the original translation of the Septuagint, and the other Greek sacred writings, the later Recensions. We need to be careful not to lump all of those things together. Now, of course, we do, practically speaking, because we'll say, what does the MT say? What does the Septuagint say? And so generally speaking, that's going to happen and that's fine. But when you're trying to be precise, make sure you distinguish between this is the Old Greek and this is, the Recension of Symmachus or something. So what are the witnesses that we have? Well, there are two types, direct and indirect. Direct witnesses are those actual manuscripts of the Septuagint that we have. So early on, these early manuscripts are written on papyrus and on leather. Later, beginning in the 4th century, you begin to see these texts that are written essentially in capitalized, what we can, maybe we would call capitalized letters. These are called uncials. And as you can see there, they look like they're in capital Greek letters. But during the Middle Ages, we begin to see minuscules. And these are the lowercase letters. And of course, if you know any Greek, or you can just look and see that, these letters look very different than the capitalized letters. And there are spaces in between, those sorts of things. So these are the direct witnesses that we have to the Septuagint. But indirect witnesses are those early translations that are made of the Septuagint. So they're important in the sense that we can look at them and try to get at what the Septuagint was saying. But remember, now you're talking about translation of a translation. When you're trying to get back to the Hebrew text, you have to bear that in mind, that you're looking at, for example, a Coptic translation of the Septuagint, of the Greek of the Septuagint, and now you're another step away from the Vorlage, the Hebrew Vorlage. So you need to bear that in mind as a text critic. So tomorrow, that's our brief introduction to the Septuagint in general. Now we're going to be coming up tomorrow, we're going to be looking at the recensions of the Septuagint and how attempts were made later on to bring the translation of the Old Greek to bring it closer to the original Hebrew. So stay tuned for that. Thanks. Hello again, everyone. Welcome to the Recensions of the Septuagint, the next part in our textual criticism series. We've been looking at the Septuagint. Today we're going to take a look at the various recensions, or at least begin to look at them, get an introduction, and we'll look at them in a bit more detail tomorrow. But we need to understand first what a recension is, particularly when it concerns the Septuagint, why they were written, and what the early recensions were. So, what is a recension? Well, it's a revision of the Old Greek translation, the Old Greek Septuagint, to make it align more precisely with the Hebrew Vorlage. So, the tradition of the Hebrew Bible developed over the early centuries, particularly the end of the first millennium BCE, and this led to the need to realign the Greek translation with the Hebrew text that was in use at the time. So remember, we talked about how by the early first millennium CE, the Masoretic text tradition was in use as the standard with the Jewish community. And so because of this, this type of development of the Masoretic text tradition, or the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew text tradition, the Jewish community that was utilizing the Greek text wanted to have their Greek text more closely align with the Hebrew Bible that they were using, and so these recensions were developed. In addition, the use of the Septuagint, the Old Greek, by the early Christians motivated the Jews to have a Greek translation of their own, which would include their own Jewish exegesis. So again, for these reasons, the recensions of the Old Greek of the Septuagint were created. So what were the early Jewish recensions, at least most likely? Qere Theodotion, Aquila, Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 1007, and Papyrus Rylands, Greek 458. Origen was an early Christian theologian, and he created an edition of the Hebrew Bible with 6 columns, the hexapla. And these 6 columns contained the Hebrew. Column 2 contained transliteration of the Hebrew text into Greek. And then among the remaining columns were several recensions of the Old Greeks, Aquila, Symmachus, and Qere Theodotion. So Tov divides the revisions, the early revisions, into 3 categories based on the hexapla. So that's where we're going to pick it up tomorrow, looking at the divisions of the revisions into their categories, the revisions of the Septuagint. So, welcome back, everyone, to our next video in the series on textual criticism. We are working our way through the Hebrew Bible. Promise we are almost done. So today we're going to look at the second part of the recensions of the Septuagint, and to kind of give you an idea, following this video, we'll do the final 3 translations, the Aramaic Targums, the Syriac Peshitta, and the Latin Vulgate. And then next week, we will do somewhat of a review to try to sort of, in summary fashion, kind of recap what we've learned thus far before we move into the New Testament. So let's get started with part 2 of the recensions of the Septuagint. We're going to look at, very briefly, an introduction to Qere Theodotion, Aquila, Symmachus, Origen's hexapla, and finally the Lycianic recension. So this certainly does not cover all of the recensions, but these are some of the more significant recensions that, as a text critic, you need to be aware of. So, we've talked a little about the Qere Theodotion recension. Dates to, at the latest, the middle of the 1st century CE, but probably a fair amount earlier. the reason that it's called the Qere recension is that it has an idiosyncratic way of translating the word gam, which in Hebrew means also. So the Hebrew word gam is very frequently translated with the Greek word kaige, which is a combination of the words kai and ge, which means at least. And this reflects a method of Jewish interpretation of the Hebrew word gam. It was thought that Theodotion early on was responsible for this recension, so in antiquity, that's who was attributed with this translation. With this recension. Aquila, written approximately 125 CE. This is the most literal or wooden recension. So every word, letter, and grammatical marker, each was understood to hold meaning. And so one of the things that shows up that's idiosyncratic is this rigid translation of the particle et in Hebrew, which is a direct object marker. Oh, and that hyphen should be on the other side. I'm telling you, that reverse Hebrew script screws me up. Anyhow, it should be et, and that dash should be over on the left. Anyhow, I know that's being a little too picky. So he translated et, which is a grammatical marker that sometimes, or not nearly as frequently, means with. That marker, et, is most often left untranslated. All it does in the sentence is tell the reader that the word that comes after it is a definite direct object. So it marks the direct object. And if you don't know what that means, that's fine. You don't have to know. It's not a big deal. We'll do a video on it maybe. But because sometimes it can mean with, he translated it woodenly with every time because he felt that grammatical marker held meaning and needed to be represented in the Greek text. So it's a very literal wooden recension. Symmachus, end of the 2nd century or beginning of the 3rd century CE. His recension tended to be more paraphrastic. He was trying to get at the meaning of the text as opposed to woodenly translating what the text said. So after these 3 recensions came the Hexapla by Origen. So Origen, an early Christian theologian, mid-3rd century, created an edition of the Hebrew Bible in 6 columns, and he called it the Hexapla. It contained the recensions of Aquila, Symmachus, and Qere Theodotion. No, it's fine. It's a nice edition. A British tar is a soaring soul. Okay. I love that song. Anyway. All right. I don't remember where we were. Okay. So finally, after the Hexapla, we have other recensions, but one that we should probably note is the recension of Lucian. And it dates to the late 3rd century. And the thing that we want to note about it is that the Lucianic recension at times agrees with some of the Qumran manuscripts. Okay, so we've gone through the recensions to the Septuagint. I know maybe for some of us this is dragging a little bit. I apologize for that if it is. But I think it's good to just briefly give a cursory overview of all of these things. Tomorrow we're going to wrap it up with the Aramaic Targums, the Syriac Peshitta, and the Latin Vulgate. We will hit those, very, very briefly. And then we'll move on to sort of a tying it all together look at textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible. So stay with us. Good evening, everyone. We are just about done with the Hebrew Bible. That sounds bad. We're just about done with the textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible. And we're going to look at the final part of the ancient translations of the Hebrew Bible, looking at the Aramaic Targums, the Syriac Peshitta, and the Latin Vulgate. Now, as you can see, I'm doing this all in one presentation, so I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail on any of these. I just sort of want to give this cursory overview so that you can be familiar with the sources themselves. If you do have an interest in any one of these, Of course, these aren't my areas of specialization, the Targums or the Peshitta, but or the Vulgate for that matter. But I can at least direct you in the right to the right place. So, but let's take a look at them. So, as I said, we're going to look at these three: the Aramaic Targums, the Syriac Peshitta, and the Latin Vulgate. So, Targum itself is an Aramaic word. Quadrilateral root means an explanation, a commentary, or a translation, which is exactly what that was. So, likely these developed orally originally, but as Aramaic became the more common language during the first millennium BCE, the need to translate the Hebrew into a more useful, at least in the common vernacular, translation arose, and so the Targums were developed. We have Targums found as early as Qumran, so that they are very early, and most of the text of the Targumim reflect the MT tradition. So it's important to remember that as a text critic. But these are the Targums, the Aramaic translations of the Hebrew Bible. So for the Torah, we have Targum Onkelos, the Jerusalem Targums, the Cairo Geniza Targums, and Targum Neophiti. And for the prophets, we have Targum Jonathan. Again, I know I'm moving through this quickly, but this is just to give you an idea of the different Targums that we have available to us. Now, that nifty script off to the side is called Syriac. And the Peshitta is the simple translation. It's very close to the MT, just like the Targums, as far as its tradition is concerned. And the oldest manuscript comes from the 5th century CE. So that's the Syriac Peshitta. And then finally, the Latin Vulgate. So at the end of the 4th century, and that's CE, Jerome translated the Bible into Latin. The Hebrew source for the Old Testament portion, as the others, to follow the MT tradition, which again is unsurprising to us. So I know that was fast. I apologize for if it was too fast, but Monday, what we're going to do is just take a daily data. It might be a little bit longer, I'm not sure, and try to just review what we've covered thus far for the Old Testament. We've talked about textual criticism in general, and then we went through the Old Testament. And before we move into the New, I sort of want to do a recap, a little summary, so that everybody's on the same page. And it'll make it easier, I think, to have all that in one place in one video. So we'll see you next week, and enjoy your weekend. Thanks. Welcome back, everyone, to Textual Criticism. This is a summary of the textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible. We're going to quickly go through essentially everything we've looked at thus far so that we can sort of tie it all together. You can have it in one place to briefly overview or summarize. We're going to look at the layout of Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, or BHS, look at some of the general errors that take place in transmission. Then we're going to look at the Masoretic textual tradition, the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Qumran texts, the Septuagint and its recensions, and then finally the other translations. So the layout of BHS, if you remember, there's the main text in the critical edition, then the notes in the margin and underneath of the main text, the Masorah, the Qere and Ketiv out in the notes, amongst other things, and then finally the critical apparatus. So let's review, take a look at it. Here is the main body of the text. Here are the Masorah, and then there underneath of the yellow is the critical apparatus. And if you remember the way that it works, here in the text, if we see that small b, it tells us to go down here to find that small b, and that tells us what the variation is. So here it says the multitude of manuscripts and the Samaritan Pentateuch have elb as opposed to l. Now, the types of errors, if you recall, this isn't going to review all of them, but there are unintentional and intentional errors. So examples of unintentional errors would be mistaken letters, homophony, things that sound the same but are actually different, and dittography, doubling something in the writing. These are all unintentional mistakes. Intentional errors are those that the scribe intentionally updates things like spelling and grammar, or resolving difficulties in the text, or changing things that are considered inappropriate in the text to things that are euphemisms. Now, the Masoretic textual tradition, if you remember, it was originally in consonantal form. It originated during the Second Temple period. We don't know exactly when it began, but we have evidence of it throughout at least the second half of the Second Temple period. It became authoritative to the Jewish community by the 2nd century CE, and there were 3 periods of transmission, the Second Temple period through the Middle Ages. The Samaritan Pentateuch. In northern Israel, they considered Gerizim, not Jerusalem, their holy place, and because of that, it influenced their Pentateuch, their Torah. They only recognized the Torah as authoritative, and so that's what was transmitted, and the ideological changes that accompanied their northern beliefs were added to the text. Now, the texts from Qumran. They were discovered in 1947, just south of Jericho, in the Judean desert. The texts copied by the Qumran community during the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE. There were over 200 biblical scrolls, with almost all of the biblical texts from the Old Testament. The Great Isaiah Scroll comes from Qumran, and some of these texts were written in the Old Paleo-Hebrew script. The Septuagint, a very important translation. It translates the Hebrew text into Greek. The Greek translation dates to the 3rd century BCE. The New Testament and the early church fathers quote from the Septuagint. And there were several later recensions which aimed at bringing the Old Greek, the original translation, more in line with the developed Hebrew tradition. There were other translations, which included the Aramaic Targums, the Syriac Peshitta, the simple translation, and the Latin Vulgate. So that summarizes what we've covered in Old Testament textual criticism for any of these topics. There is at least one video, if not more, so please go back and review them if you are so inclined. Starting tomorrow, we're going to look at textual criticism of the New Testament and try to do essentially the same thing that we did with the Old Testament, sort of piece by piece, looking at how New Testament textual criticism is done. So please stay with us. Thanks. Welcome back, everyone, to our series on textual criticism. Today we're starting the New Testament series. After a brief introduction, we'll look at the writing materials and source identification. We're using Kurt-Aland's book, The Text of the New Testament, an introduction to the critical editions and theory and practice of modern textual criticism, 1995. Excellent resource. So again, we're going to have a brief introduction, then we're going to look at some of the basic writing materials that were used for the New Testament texts, and then finally the system of symbols that were used early on and how they have changed into what we use today. By way of introduction, the 27 books of the New Testament were initially circulated as separate literary units. Paul's writings were likely the earliest to be collected. We have evidence of this from at least 95 AD. By 180 AD or CE, we read about the Gospels as part of a collection. In the beginning in the 3rd century, the Gospels and Acts are found together. The Catholic letters were collected later in the 4th century. Now, papyrus was the earliest material to be used for the New Testament manuscripts. Papyrus comes primarily from Egypt. That's where it was primarily manufactured. Strips were cut and laid side by side, and then additional strips were cut and laid perpendicular to those, laid side by side, and then they were moistened and fused together that way when they dried. They were formed into rolls of up to 10 meters, as opposed to ending up in scroll form. We see the codex used in the New Testament. It was easier to write on the obverse, but the direction of the fibers made it more difficult to write on the reverse of each page. Just as sort of a nota bene, the nomina sacra is characteristic of the early papyri, and this is the abbreviation of the word kurios, here with kappa sigma, with a line over it, and theos with theta sigma. And Jewish or Christian origin of the copies of the Septuagint can be identified based on the use of the nomina sacra forms. So you can identify this manuscript of the Septuagint as either of Jewish origin or of Christian origin based on the use of these forms. So an important thing to note. When we move past papyri, we move into parchment. Parchment came into use in the 4th century. It was made of animal hide, usually sheep or goat. The hair was removed and it was treated and rubbed with stone and other things, but it was more durable than the papyrus, but the strips of the papyrus allowed for this these horizontal lines, natural horizontal lines when writing on it. These were not present in the parchment, and so incisions had to be made, lines had to be incised to follow in writing. Paper became commonly used starting in the 12th century. We have the earliest evidence of paper being used in the New Testament text from the 9th century, but it's very common, or it's more common in the 12th and on. Out of the 5,400 New Testament manuscripts, approximately 1,300 of them are written on paper. Now, having looked at how the books generally circulated originally and the different basic materials for New Testament texts, let's take a look at what we will use as text critics when we look at the individual manuscripts, how they are identified in our New Testament editions. So how did this develop? Well, the first New Testament edition, Greek New Testament edition, was made by Erasmus. In 1516, it was published in a hurry, and it was based on only about 4 or 5 manuscripts in the New Testament. As a matter of fact, without getting into a lot of detail here, when he went through the book of Revelation, at the end, the manuscript was a barred manuscript, and it was fairly deteriorated and broken off altogether. And so he back translated the text, which brought into Greek, which produced an awful lot of errors. Wettstein in 1751, 1752, he had 200 manuscripts or so at his disposal for his edition, and he identified uncials using capital letters, minuscules using Arabic numbers, as well as the lectionaries. He used numbers as well, and this is how he identified the individual manuscripts in the edition. Caspar René Gregory in 1908 identified the papyri using the initial P, so P45, P51. He kept the numbering system of the uncials, the capital, quote-unquote, letters, text of the capital letters, with the 01, 02, 03, that's what he utilized, but he kept Wettstein's capital letters for the first 45 uncials. And we'll get into that a little more as we start looking at the apparatus, or when we start looking at the apparatus. The minuscules, he kept the numbering system, and then with the lectionaries, he used the prefix L to identify them. Okay, so that's a brief introduction to the New Testament texts. Coming up, we're going to look at how to use Qere and Barbara Aland's book to identify which manuscripts, or how to identify the manuscripts of the New Testament so that you can understand how to use this resource more effectively. So stay tuned. Hey everybody, welcome back to part 2 of the textual criticism of the New Testament. Today we're going to be looking at the basics of early transmission of the New Testament text. I know I said that we were going to look at Kurt and Barbara Alon's book and how to identify and find manuscripts of the New Testament text, but I thought I'd save that till tomorrow and give a little bit more of an introduction to the transmission of the New Testament text. There's some basic information that Alon puts forth in the early chapters of his book that the text critic should keep in mind moving forward, practicing New Testament textual criticism. So I've taken a quote from page 67, something that we all need to keep in mind. New Testament textual criticism must always keep in mind and consider the implications of what has been learned from studies in the history of the canon and from early church history, if its conclusions are to be sound. And this is something that I think is extraordinarily important, and we've looked at it to some degree in the Old Testament text. You know, these things were not transmitted in a vacuum. And so understanding the time, the context, the historical period, it's very important to understanding how the text was transmitted and in practicing textual criticism. So there are several things that he points out that we need to keep in mind, sort of benchmarks. One is by the second half of the 2nd century, the Gospels began to circulate as a collection. We noted that yesterday. And the pastoral letters were added to and began to circulate with the Pauline corpus. So this is in the second half of the 2nd century. But by the year 200, or around there, the New Testament began to be translated, or was being commonly translated into other languages. So in the West, the text was we have evidence, in the West, we have Latin manuscripts. In Egypt, we have manuscripts in Coptic. And in Syria, we have manuscripts in Syriac. Now, there's a question that they deal with in their book. Was there a Western text type? By the year 200, the West was, for all intents and purposes, no longer a significant factor in the transmission of the New Testament text. And this was partly due to the fact that all of the influential theologians were in or from the East. So there were theologians that moved into the West, but these were from the East. And that there is not enough evidence to support a Western text type. And this is important. Moving forward, trying to understand the different families, the different text types, the different traditions from the first part of the first millennium CE. Understanding that the New Testament, when it was transmitted early on, was considered to some degree a living text is extremely important when we come to the variants that we see in the manuscripts. Until the beginning of the 4th century, unlike the Hebrew text, as we looked at in previous videos, the copyists felt free to correct and or improve upon the New Testament text or manuscripts as they saw fit and as they copied. Part of this was that they believed that they were filled with the Holy Spirit, which allowed them or afforded them this freedom. When we see the variation, it can very well be due to this living text idea. To balance that, there was a type of rigidity that was seen in the New Testament text. In these different text types, these different textual traditions, we see that there is a tendency for a particular reading, once it enters the textual tradition, to stay that way, to stay there. So the individual text types tended to keep their individual readings as they were transmitted.
You're almost done.
Almost done. Silly. Now we know that individuals, not scriptoria, were responsible for the transmission, the copying of these text types. By the way, I have Piper here. If you hear an apple crunching in the background, that's her.
And I I'm sleepy.
Yep. So individuals were responsible for copying the text. Now, 𒀭Aland gives the example, the metaphor of individual centers of copying, centers of transmission. He likens them unto ripples in a pond, or a stone being thrown into a pond and creating ripples. As a text was copied in a particular area, the effects were transmitted out from that area, and when a text moved and was copied in another area in addition to that first area, it created its own ripples, and when the ripples overlapped with one another, there was an intermingling of text types, which makes it extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible, often to follow these text types back all the way. Finally, he notes that persecutions of Diocletian resulted in multitudes of manuscripts being destroyed, which had effects for later transmission. So, as promised, tomorrow I will try to give an introductory overview of how to use 𒀭Aland's book to identify individual manuscripts of the New Testament. So stay with us. Come say goodbye.
Goodbye.
Welcome back again to Textual Criticism of the New Testament. This is part 3. We're looking in a bit more detail at the sources that we can use for doing textual criticism of the New Testament Greek text. So briefly, we're going to look today at the distribution, both by age and by content, of the New Testament manuscripts. How old are these manuscripts? Where do they cluster as far as age is concerned? Do we have more manuscripts early? Do we have more manuscripts later? Then try to give an idea of the distribution by content. So which books do we have the most? Or which books are represented and by what number? And then finally, we're going to take a look at 4 of the big sources that we have for the New Testament text, the 4 great uncials. The earliest manuscripts that we have of the New Testament text come from the 2nd century. We have 2 papyri. The latest papyri that we have are in the 8th century. The uncials, minuscules, and the lectionaries, if you remember from our last video, these 3 all come together in with some regularity in the 9th century, and it's about the time that the papyri, obviously the latest papyri in the 8th century, so it's when the uncials, minuscules, and lectionaries are starting to take over. And the 11th through the 14th centuries show the greatest number of manuscripts extant, and of course that makes some logical sense, right? Because they're younger and so they're better preserved, whereas 1,800-year-old papyri, there aren't nearly as many. But that's sort of the distribution by age. The earliest come from the 2nd century. The papyri sort of run out in the 8th. We have minuscules, uncials, and lectionaries that are really picking up in the 9th century. But the bulk of our evidence is coming from the 11th to the 14th centuries. Now, when we think about their distribution by content, we have 3 uncials and 56 minuscules that contain the entirety of the New Testament text. 2 of the uncials and 147 minuscules have everything except the book of Revelation, which, given its transmissional history and its acceptance into the canon, is not terribly surprising. We have 1 uncial and 75 minuscules that have everything except the Gospels. And this sort of variation is common among the preserved manuscripts. And if you look at 𒀭Aland's book, he gives a breakdown of many of the different variations, the combinations that exist, or what books are preserved where. So in general, with the Gospels, we have 2,361 manuscripts. We have 662 manuscripts of the book of Acts, the Acts of the Apostles. The Pauline letters are preserved in 792 manuscripts. The book of Revelation, 287 manuscripts. Now, when we think about our major sources for the Greek New Testament, there are 4 that we need to consider. The first is Codex Alexandrinus. When we begin to do textual criticism, or when you start to do textual criticism on your own, you look at the apparatus, you're going to see that Codex Alexandrinus is represented by A, or Uncial 02. It's a 5th century manuscript, and it contains the entirety of the New Testament. Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus is represented as C, or Uncial 04. It is also a 5th century manuscript, and it contains the entirety of the New Testament text. Codex Sinaiticus is represented by the Hebrew letter Aleph, Uncial 01. It is a 4th century manuscript, so slightly earlier, and it contains the entirety of the New Testament text as well. Finally, Codex Vaticanus, represented as B, or 03, is a 4th century manuscript, and while it doesn't contain the entirety of the New Testament text, it has the Gospels through chapter 9, partway through chapter 9 of the book of Hebrews. So these are our 4 great uncials, very important for textual criticism. So, coming up, and I know I've been promising this, and I apologize, we're going to be looking at what I'm calling part 2 of using Aland's book to identify the manuscripts. The goal of tomorrow is to actually give you some working knowledge of how to use his book as a resource to identify New Testament manuscripts, be they uncials, minuscules, and papyri, lectionary, so forth. So stay tuned for that. Here we are again, part 4 of textual criticism of the New Testament. We're moving our way through. Today we're going to be looking finally at utilizing Kurt and Barbara Aland's book on the text of the New Testament as a resource to identify individual manuscripts. So the book is a tremendous resource for identifying the various New Testament manuscripts, be they papyri, uncials, or minuscules. And so what I'm going to do is sort of as a practical guide, take you through 3 different examples of these sections of the book and try to lay out the various manuscripts, identifying them so that you, when you do your textual criticism, if you see the symbol Aleph, you'll know, this is this particular uncial, and you can use Aland's book to get a bunch of information on that particular uncial. So let's start with the papyri. In his descriptive list of the papyri, he has the papyri listed P1, P2, P3 in that order. And he tells you that Papyrus 1 contains Matthew 1, 1 to 9, 12, 14 to 20. It's a 3rd century manuscript, and it's housed in Philadelphia in the University Museum in Pennsylvania. And then there's some bibliographic information about it. The same thing here with Papyrus 2. So it contains John 12, 12 through 15, and Luke 7, 22 to 26, and verse 50, but in the Coptic. It's a 6th century manuscript, and it's housed in Florence. And so on down. So when you turn to the section on the papyri, you can literally go down and find, what does Papyrus 8 have? Oh, Papyrus 8 contains Acts chapter 4, verses 31 to 37, Acts chapter 5, verses 2 through 9, 6, 1 to 6, and 8 to 15, and it's a 4th century manuscript. And if I wanted to go find it, I'd find it in Berlin. And then there's some basic bibliographic information concerning that manuscript. So that's the papyri. That's how you use Aland's book to identify and gain some basic information on the various papyri. When we look at the uncials, very similar setup. It's going to give you the nomenclature, right? So Aleph is uncial 01. They're the same thing. And this is Codex Sinaiticus. It's a 4th century manuscript. It contains the epistles, Acts of the Apostles, the Pauline letters, and the book of Revelation. So everything. So it's a 4th century manuscript. And then there's some basic information about it. And similarly, when you come to Alexandrinus, here it's A02, and it contains also the Gospels, the Apostles, the Pauline letters, and Revelation. It is a 5th century manuscript, and then, of course, this is the bottom of the page, so it would continue on in the next page. The uncials are laid out in this way. I think the first 45 have their lettering in front of them, and then it just goes on to 046, 047, and so on. Finally, the minuscules. He doesn't lay out all of the minuscules. These are just what he considers to be the most important. So, minuscule 1, the Gospels, Acts, Pauline epistles, is a 12th century manuscript. And the same thing here, a 14th century manuscript. Here's what it contains. And so on. So again, all the basic information that you need for these minuscules. There's also a section on lectionaries. This is an invaluable resource. So when you're going through the apparatus and you see Aleph or B or 049, and you say 049, what is that? Oh, right, that's an uncial. Well, what is it? Let me go see if I can pull it up. You go to Aland's book under the uncial section, and you can identify some very basic information about it and where you can go for further information. So it's a tremendous resource for doing New Testament textual criticism. In our next lesson, we're going to begin to look at the early translations of the New Testament. As with the Old Testament, the New Testament was translated into different languages, and we're going to begin to look at the ancient translations of the New Testament text. So stay with us. Well, here we are again, textual criticism of the New Testament, introduction to the ancient New Testament translations. Again, we are utilizing Qere and Ketiv's book, the text of the New Testament. And let's get started. I'm going to give a brief introduction to the ancient translations, then we're going to look today at the Old Latin and the Latin Vulgate. Translations of the New Testament text begin to appear around 180 CE. Now, in textual criticism, their value has been overrated in Aland's estimation. Too great a weight has been placed on them to attempt to recover the Greek of the New Testament text, given that we have much earlier manuscripts than those that make up the Byzantine text. In his opinion, there's really no reason to rely so heavily on the translations. However, they can be valuable for textual criticism when they either are derived directly from the Greek, in other words, they're a translation directly from the Greek, or they're revised based on a Greek text. Now, what does that mean? Well, let's say we have our translation. If that translation comes directly from a Greek manuscript, if it's coming directly from the Greek text, then it is valuable because it's referring back directly, it's translating directly from the Greek text. But it's also valuable for textual criticism if, as with the Septuagint, the later recensions of the Septuagint were attempts to get back to the original Hebrew. And so if a translation is revised, but it's being revised based on a Greek manuscript, then that also is valuable because, again, it's going back to an original Greek manuscript. It is not relying solely on a non-Greek source. Let's look at the Old Latin. Latin was a very important language, obviously the early church. The earliest Latin of the New Testament we can find in the quotations of Tertullian, which he began to write the latter part of the 2nd century. But Latin manuscripts of the New Testament do not regularly circulate, or they're not found until around 250 CE. There were so many copies by the end of the 4th century that the complexity of the Latin manuscript tradition had become very, very great. Now, the Latin Vulgate was thought to have been produced by Jerome in the late 4th century, during this period where the textual tradition, the Latin textual tradition, had become very complex due to the significant number of manuscripts. Now, Jerome revised the Gospels, so he himself revised the text of the Gospels, and he translated afresh from the Hebrew, translated the Old Testament again from the Hebrew. However, the text outside of the Gospels, the Pauline letters and Revelation, was completed later by unknown source, but we know that the Gospels were revised and the Old Testament was translated directly from the Hebrew. Now, if you want to see a list of the most important manuscripts of the Latin Vulgate, you can go to Aland's book, page 192, and he lists them out. So tomorrow, we are going to finish up the versions by looking at the Syriac, the Coptic, and a handful of other versions that are found of the Greek New Testament. So stay with us. Welcome back, everyone, to Textual Criticism of the New Testament. This is part 6. We're looking at the Syriac, the Coptic, and the other New Testament translations. So we're going to take a look at the Syriac, the Coptic translation, and a handful of the other translations of the New Testament. The earliest attestation of the Syriac New Testament is the gathering of the 4 Gospels together by Tatian, late 2nd century in the Diatessaron. Likewise, the Old Syriac is 5th century, and it contains the Gospels as well. There are 2 manuscripts, and the translation itself is very close to the Diatessaron. More popular, though, is the Syriac Peshitta. The Peshitta is the most widely attested. It is the common version of the Syriac. It contains the 22 New Testament books. It lacks 2nd and 3rd John, 2nd Peter, Jude, and Book of Revelation. It also deletes some portions of the Gospels, but it contains the majority of the New Testament. The earliest extant manuscripts are from the 5th and 6th centuries. Now, the Coptic is the Egyptian translation of the New Testament. Early Christianity in Egypt is unclear. It's difficult to ascertain. The Greeks, it was a Greek-speaking church in Egypt, at least through the 6th century, if not longer. However, we have the Coptic translation at least by the end of the 3rd century. There are 7 dialects of the Coptic: the Sahidic, the Bohairic, the Fayumic, Akhmimic, Subakhmimic, Middle Egyptian, and Proto-Bohairic. There are other translations, such as the Armenian, which is based on the Old Syriac, the Gregorian, which is based on the Armenian, Ethiopic, which is based on the Greek, Syriac, and then finally the Gothic, which is based on the Greek. Beginning next week, we're going to take a look at the Nestle-Aland 27 in a bit more detail than we looked at in an earlier episode of Textual Criticism, so stay with us. Welcome back, everyone, to Textual Criticism of the New Testament, Part 7. We are getting into using the Nestle-Aland 27 text, the critical edition. We've touched on this briefly in an earlier video, but I wanted to go back over it, perhaps in a bit more detail, so that you can understand as you start to work through text critical problems, how you can use the apparatus to do effective textual criticism. So we're going to look at the general principles of using Nestle-Aland 27. We're going to take an example from Matthew chapter 21, verses 28 to 32, something that he does in his book. And then finally, we'll look at some of the symbols in the apparatus and how you can find what they mean at a glance using Aland's book. So in the main text, there are symbols that are inserted into the text that indicate variations that appear in other manuscripts. The symbols can indicate that text is omitted, or it is added, or it is replaced. It can also indicate that there's a varying word order with a series of words. So there are all kinds of things that these symbols can indicate. Some of the symbols in the main text include a 0 for an omission. That little T-looking symbol indicates an insertion. And then if they want to indicate that more than one word is omitted, they will put a box at the beginning of a series of words and then an angled slash at the end to say that from the box to the slash, all those words are omitted in other manuscripts. Of course, there are other symbols, but these are some of the common ones. So here we have a page from Nestle-Aland 27. You can see, so by way of quick review, this is the main body text of the critical edition. And this is the apparatus down here. And then if we go through, this little angle iron is a symbol. This is an omission symbol here. Here's another set of symbols here, and so on. So these are just symbols that are put into the text so that you can see where there are variations. So let's go to a specific couple of examples from this particular page. I've enlarged the body text of verses 28 to 32 and the apparatus for the same verses. So if you look up here in the upper right-hand corner, you see that circle before the word kai, which means and. And what that is indicating is that if you go down to the apparatus, it's going to show you in verse 28, where you see that circle, you're going to see all the manuscripts that omit the word kai in their manuscript. So if you come down here, there's that circle. The cross indicates that in the previous edition of Nestle-Aland, so Nestle-Aland 26, they actually did omit the word kai from their critical text. It's omitted in Aleph, the original hand of the scribe, Codex Sinaiticus, uncials L and Z, the Old Latin E, FF1, and so on, Syriac and the Coptic. So all of these manuscripts omit kai. However, it shows the evidence that supports reading kai in the manuscript, or supports the reading that's in the text. So Aleph second corrector, uncials B, C, D, W, theta, and so on. And of course the majority text, shown by that M there toward the end, all preserve kai in their reading. So this is how you would differentiate which manuscripts have kai and which omit it. Another example we can take a look at is this little angle iron. This angle iron indicates that the word following is replaced in other manuscript traditions by a different word. So if you come down here to the apparatus, the word you can see there on the left, deutero, Aleph second corrector, B, C second corrector, L, Z, and so on. All of those manuscripts have deutero as opposed to hetero. And this tells you that this word is replaced in these other manuscripts. So there are many notes in the apparatus itself, and they can be confusing. So on pages 240 and following, Aland has put a number of explanations for what these notes are, little descriptions. So for example, examples of notes that you'll see in the apparatus that he defines in the book in a very user-friendly way. PC, paucity, or pauci, a few. These are obviously Latin terms. PM, per multi, a great many, reliqui, the rest. When you see these in there, it's indicating that, for example, if you see PC, it means only a few manuscripts have this. PM, a great many manuscripts. If you see RELL, it's the rest of the manuscripts have this. And there are many such notes. or little markings. And on pages 240 and following, he goes through and identifies what they are and gives explanations. So all of the notations that appear in the apparatus are explained on those pages. It's actually a very useful resource for knowing how to use, for understanding how to use Nestle-Aland 27, both in the main text and in the apparatus. And as you start to do textual criticism of the New Testament, or if you're doing it now and you want to do it a little bit more precisely, this is a tremendous resource. Of course, it's not the only resource, but it's one that I would highly recommend. So tomorrow we're going to start to look at Aland's 12 rules for textual criticism. And I think that as you begin to do textual criticism, you may not agree with all of them, and you may come up with or you may follow a different form of textual criticism, applying different sets of rules. Nonetheless, these are extraordinarily important to know, and I think very important to practice personally. So stay tuned. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Part 8 of Textual Criticism of the New Testament. This will be the last installment of our textual criticism series. Hooray! We're going to close out with Aland's 12 rules of textual criticism. So, there's a debate, and maybe in a later video, if you guys want, we can talk about the majority text versus the critical view of textual criticism. But, I think these 12 rules are very important to consider when approaching a text. Even if you hold to the majority text view, you can't just ignore these rules of critical textual criticism. So, let's take a look at what they are. Rule number 1. Only one reading can be original, however many variant readings there may be. And this is, of course, working on the understanding that the text was originally composed and it had an original reading, and that variants arose from that. So there can only be one original reading. Only the reading which best satisfies the requirements of both external and internal criteria can be original. So Rule 2, of course, deals with the reading that best explains both the internal consistency of the text and the manuscript tradition can be considered the original. Rule 3, criticism of the text must always begin from the evidence of the manuscript tradition, and only afterward to a consideration of internal evidence. In other words, we can't say, well, I really want Paul to say this, because that's what the chapter seems to indicate. We have to start with the manuscript tradition, the external evidence, before we move inward. Rule 4, internal criteria, the context of the passage, its style and vocabulary, the theological environment of the author, etc., can never be the sole basis for a critical decision, especially in opposition to the external evidence. So this is just a continuation or a nuance of Rule 3. You can't just have the passage dictate internally, especially if it goes against the external evidence. Rule 5. The primary authority for a critical textual decision lies with the Greek manuscript tradition, with the versions and fathers serving no more than a supplementary and corroborative function, particularly in passages where their underlying Greek text cannot be reconstructed with absolute certainty. Greek has to be given primary authority, even if you know that, generally speaking, the father, church father, for example, is quoting something, and if you don't know that he's quoting from the Greek, you cannot reconstruct it, giving it the same authority as the Greek manuscript tradition. Rule 6. Furthermore, manuscripts should be weighted, not counted, and the peculiar traits of each manuscript should be duly considered. And this is important because there's a temptation when you do textual criticism to look down in that apparatus and say, well, I got 4 on this side and I got 7 on that side. It must be the one that's on 7. You can't do that. They need to be weighted. The principle that the original reading may be found in a single manuscript or version when it stands alone or nearly alone is only a theoretical possibility. So Rule 7 is describing this idea that when you have something in a single manuscript or a version, you need to challenge that idea and say, why is it only here? Rule 8, the reconstruction of a stemma of readings for each variant, the genealogical principle, is an extremely important device because the reading which can most easily explain the derivation of the other forms is itself most likely the original. So again, you want to reconstruct these genealogical families so that you can identify which reading most likely led to the others. Rule 9. Variants must never be treated in isolation, but always considered in the context of the tradition. So you don't want to go to a particular variant and say, this one makes more sense, and ignore all of the nuances that have come with that particular tradition. You have to consider it in context. Rule 10. There is truth in the maxim, the more difficult reading is the more probable reading. But this principle must not be taken too mechanically, with the most difficult reading adopted as original simply because of its degree of difficulty. So it's true, the more difficult reading is the more probable reading because the scribe is more likely to correct it to something that makes it easier to understand. However, you can't just say, well, this one makes absolutely the least amount of sense, therefore it's the correct reading. It's a principle, it's a guideline, but it's something that you need to weigh with the other evidence. Similarly, Rule 11, the maxim, the shorter reading is the more probable reading, is certainly right in many instances, but he goes on to say, just as with the previous rule, it cannot be applied mechanically. Finally, a constantly maintained familiarity with New Testament manuscripts themselves is the best training for textual criticism. And I want to camp on this for just a moment before we close and say that really understanding and reading and immersing oneself in the manuscript tradition, in the Greek, or in the Hebrew with the Hebrew Bible, this is really the best training for textual criticism because you begin to anticipate, you understand what it is that individual hands are doing. And in that sense, you can begin to anticipate, this is a problem that I've seen before. This is common to this manuscript family or this tradition. And so it makes sense that I've seen this problem before. I've seen this error before. I've seen this variation before. And now I understand how it fits into this particular passage. In short, it's very difficult to come to textual criticism afresh. It's difficult to come to it without having really immersed oneself in all of the complexities that are these Greek and Hebrew manuscripts. So the best training is to read widely in these different textual traditions. Well, there we are, the end of textual criticism, both the Old and the New Testament. Of course, there's much more that could be said, and if there is a strong desire for people to hear more about specifics, we can definitely do that. I just thought this was a good closing point. And we're going to move on back to the ancient Near East in general, back to Mesopotamia. And we're going to be looking at Elio Oppenheim's book, who gives an introduction to ancient Mesopotamia. And I think it's going to be a lot of fun. It'll be very telling, or it'll be very enlightening. And I think it'll give us a good starting point to go into different discussions of Mesopotamian topics. So